damp wool, heavy as a shroud. Smith tugged the collar of his greatcoat tighter, the fabric stiff with river mist and the acrid tang of coal smoke that clung to London like a second skin. The fog did not merely obscure, it pressed. It shoved against his chest, a physical weight that made each breath a labor, tasting of brine from the low tide and the rotting organic sludge of the Thames banks. His boots slipped on the slick pavement of Palace Yard, the cobblestones gleaming black under the guttering yellow eye of a street lamp that struggled against the grey afternoon. 5 o'clock approached. The light was already dying, strangled by the miasma. He walked with the stoop of a man who had spent too many years hunched over petitions by candlelight, his spine curved into a permanent question mark. At 57, William Smith felt every one of his years in the ache of his knees, a sharp, grinding protest against the cold stone beneath his soles. He was late, not disastrously so, but late enough to invite the sharp glance of the speaker, late enough to miss the preliminary murmurs before the real business began. Yet his mind refused to quicken its pace to match his feet. It remained tangled in the knots of Nottinghamshire, in the broken frames and the starving faces of the weavers he had met only a week prior. Order, he must speak for order. The House demanded it. The King demanded it. The very fabric of the realm seemed to fray at the edges, threatened by the Luddite hammers smashing machinery in the north, by the whisper of Jacobin poison seeping into the hearts of desperate men. But God help him, he understood the hunger. A cart rumbled past, its iron-rimmed wheels sending a shower of muddy water onto the hem of his coat. Smith flinched, stepping back onto the narrow strip of pavement where a group of chimney sweeps huddled, their faces blackened, eyes wide and white in the gloom. They did not speak. They merely watched him, a Whig MP in a decent coat, passing through their world like a ghost who had forgotten to die. "Move along," a constable barked, his voice rough, emerging from the fog like a blunt instrument. "No loitering, get on with you." The sweep scattered, silent as rats. Smith watched them go, a lump of shame rising in his throat, bitter as bile. He wanted to call out, to offer a shilling, to explain that he was not their enemy, that he fought for them in the chamber even as he voted for the troops to quell their riots. But the words stuck. What use was a shilling against the gnawing emptiness of a winter with no work? What use were words at all when the belly screamed? He turned away, pushing open the heavy oak doors of St. Stephen's Chapel. The air inside changed instantly. The raw, wet chill of the street gave way to a stale, confined warmth, thick with the scent of wet wool drying on human bodies, the sulphurous bite of cheap tallow candles, and the underlying, metallic tang of old dust. It was the smell of power, or perhaps just the smell of too many men trapped in too small a space for too long. The noise hit him next a low, droning hum of hundreds of voices debating, arguing, posturing, a sound that vibrated in the floorboards and settled in the teeth. Smith paused in the members' lobby, shaking the rain from his hat. The corridor was crowded, a throng of MPs jostling for position, their faces flushed or pale, their expressions ranging from bored indifference to manic intensity. He navigated the press, nodding to acquaintances, ignoring the calls of those who sought to draw him into a trivial dispute about procedure. Then he saw him. Spencer Perceval stood near the entrance to the Commons chamber, isolated despite the crowd. The Prime Minister looked smaller than Smith remembered, his frame slight, almost fragile beneath the dark formal coat. His face was the color of parchment, stretched tight over high cheekbones, and his jaw was set in a grim line that suggested a man holding back a torrent of exhaustion or perhaps fear. The flickering light from the tallow sconces on the wall cast elongated, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for Perceval, to swallow him whole. Smith felt a sudden, irrational urge to turn back, to flee into the fog rather than approach that pale, still figure. But duty, that relentless taskmaster, drove him forward. He stepped closer, brushing past a burly Tory who smelled of port and unwashed linen. "Spencer," Smith said, his voice low, barely audible over the din. Perceval turned. His eyes were dark, rimmed with red, lacking any spark of recognition for a moment before focusing on Smith's face. He offered a thin, tight smile that did not reach those weary eyes. "William," Perceval replied, his voice a dry rasp, noting that you are late. The agitation grows louder. These fellows smell blood in the water. The Luddites, the radicals, all convinced the government trembles. We all tremble, Spencer, Smith murmured, glancing around to ensure no eavesdroppers leaned too close, for we must not show it, not today. Perceval let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh if it contained any humor. Show it, my dear fellow, I can hardly stand. The debt, the war, the king's madness, it is a millstone, and now this unrest in the north. If we do not act with firmness, the whole edifice crumbles. Firmness, Smith repeated, the word tasting like ash, yet he pressed on. And if firmness means sending troops to fire on starving men, he paused, the silence heavy. Is that the order we preserve? Perceval's gaze hardened, the fatigue momentarily replaced by a flash of steel. It is the only order we have, William. Without it, there is only chaos, anarchy. Do not mistake my weariness for weakness. I will do what is necessary, whatever the cost. He straightened his waistcoat, a futile gesture against the inevitable collapse of his own vitality, and turned towards the door of the chamber. For a second, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. Then he pushed through, disappearing into the roaring belly of the house. Smith stood alone in the lobby for a moment, the chill of the stones seeping through his shoes again. The encounter left a sour taste in his mouth, a sense of impending doom that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the fragility of flesh. Perceval looked like a man walking to the gallows, not to a debate. Shaking off the morbid thought, Smith retreated towards the library. He needed quiet. He needed to review the stack of petitions waiting on his desk, to find the right words to bridge the chasm between his conscience and his duty. The library was mercifully empty, the air still and heavy with the scent of old leather and paper. He sat at a small table near the window, the glass opaque with condensation, and pulled the documents towards him. His fingers traced the rough texture of the paper, feeling the uneven pressure of the quill where the weavers had signed their names with trembling hands. Justice, mercy, bread, the words blurred before his eyes. Outside, the muffled thud of boots on the runner carpets in the corridor created a rhythmic, hypnotic backdrop, a steady heartbeat of the building that lulled him into a false sense of security. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The clock in the corner began to chime the quarter hour, 4:45. Smith rubbed his eyes, the grit of fatigue scratching at his lids. He needed air. The room felt suddenly claustrophobic, the walls closing in. He stood, pushing the chair back with a scrape that sounded too loud in the silence, and walked back out into the corridor. The lobby was less crowded now, the rush to be seated having subsided, but something felt wrong. The air had shifted, charged with a static tension that made the hair on his arms rise. He scanned the room, his gaze drifting over the familiar faces, the pillars, the shadows. And there, against the far pillar near the entrance to the Commons, stood a man in a blue coat. He was unnaturally still. While others shifted their weight, whispered to neighbors, or checked their watches, this man stood like a statue carved from ice. He wore a blue coat of decent but worn fabric, his trousers dark, his hat clutched in one hand at his side. His face was pale, his features sharp and unremarkable, yet his eyes. Smith frowned, squinting through the dim light. The man was staring at the door Perceval had just entered. His gaze was fixed, glassy, devoid of blink or flutter. It was not the look of a constituent waiting for an audience, nor the patience of a petitioner hoping for a word. It was the stare of a predator watching a trap close, or perhaps a martyr awaiting the flame. A peculiar sensation crawled up Smith's spine, cold and slimy. He knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of men pushed beyond the breaking point, men for whom reason had snapped like a dry twig. The man in the blue coat did not move. He did not glance around. He simply waited, his breathing shallow, his entire being coiled around that single point of focus, the door. Smith opened his mouth to call out, to ask if the man required assistance to break the terrible stillness. But a colleague, Mr. Vaughan, appeared at his elbow, tapping his arm. "Smith, come, they are calling the question. You must be inside." Tearing his eyes away from the figure in the blue coat, Smith pointed. "Did you see that man?" he asked, gesturing towards the pillar. "The one standing there, he looks unwell." Vaughan glanced casually, dismissing the figure with a shrug. "Just another petitioner, I expect. Impatient fellow. Come along, William, do not dawdle. Perceval is on his feet." Smith hesitated, a nagging instinct screaming at him to stay, to watch, to intervene. But the pull of the chamber was strong, the routine of Parliament a powerful drug. He turned away, telling himself he was being foolish, that the gloom of the day was playing tricks on his weary mind. He took 2 steps towards the chamber door. The world exploded. A crack, violent and sharp, sliced through the drone of parliamentary debate like a tearing sheet of linen. Smith's foot halted midair, suspended above the runner carpet as the sound tore through the marrow of his bones. It was not a shout, nor the crash of falling timber, but a singular dry snap that severed the air itself. The noise hung there, vibrating against the wainscoting, before the human reaction flooded in to fill the vacuum. A scream, high, thin, and utterly devoid of reason. The lobby, previously a river of murmured confidences and shuffling boots, convulsed. Men surged backward, colliding with elbows and tricorn hats, their faces draining of color so fast it looked like a physical sickness spreading through the crowd. Smith stumbled, his shoulder banging hard against the doorframe, but he did not fall. His eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto the space where the man in the blue coat had stood. The figure had moved, or rather, the stillness had shattered. The man in the blue coat now stood with one arm extended, a wisp of white smoke curling lazily from the barrel of a pistol that looked absurdly small in his grip. He did not run, he did not drop the weapon. He simply watched, his expression blank, as the Prime Minister of Great Britain folded. Perceval did not cry out. He made a sound like a sigh, a sudden exhalation of all the air in his lungs, and crumpled forward. His knees hit the stone flags first with a sickening thud, followed by the heavy, dead weight of his torso. He lay on his side, curled slightly as if attempting to sleep, but the white of his waistcoat was already blooming into a dark, wet crimson that spread with terrifying speed across the grey stone. "Good God," Vaughan whispered, the words catching in his throat as he gripped Smith's arm, his fingers digging in with desperate strength. "He has shot him." The realization tore from him, raw and urgent. "Smith, he has shot the Prime Minister." "Perceval," someone bellowed, a raw, animal sound of denial. The lobby dissolved into chaos. A cluster of MPs rushed forward, their faces masks of horror, reaching out with trembling hands that seemed useless against the spill of blood. One man, young and fair-haired, dropped to his knees beside the fallen leader, pressing a handkerchief to the wound with frantic, useless pressure. The red soaked through the linen instantly, staining the cuff of his sleeve. "Stand back," a voice commanded, though it shook. "Give him air." "There is no air," Smith heard himself say, the words slipping out before he could check them. "Look at him." Perceval's eyes were open, staring at nothing, the light behind them already extinguished. The grim determination that had set his jaw only minutes ago was gone, replaced by a slack, terrifying neutrality. The blood pooled around his head, creeping towards the hem of Smith's own shoe. Smith flinched, dragging his foot back, the sole of his boot making a wet, sucking sound as it lifted from the stone. The man in the blue coat remained where he was. He lowered the pistol slowly, examining it as if checking for a flaw in the mechanism, then tucked it calmly into his pocket. He adjusted his cuffs, a gesture of mundane fastidiousness that clashed violently with the screaming room around him. "Seize him," Vaughan shouted, finding his voice at last. He lunged forward, but a throng of others was already upon the assassin. Hands grabbed at the blue coat, yanking, tearing. The man in blue did not resist. He allowed himself to be spun around, his hat knocked askew, revealing a forehead high and pale. His face was not twisted in rage or triumph. It was composed, almost serene, as though he had just completed a tedious business transaction and was now waiting for the receipt. "I am Mr. Bellingham," he said, his voice clear and distinct, cutting through the din of weeping and shouting. "I am the gentleman." "Madman," someone spat. "Murderer." "Justice," Bellingham corrected softly, though no one listened. He allowed himself to be shoved against the pillar, the rough stone scraping his cheek, while 3 men held him fast by the arms and collar. Smith stood frozen, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps that burned his throat. The smell hit him then, cutting through the scent of wet wool and tallow. It was coppery, sharp, the distinct metallic tang of fresh blood mixing with the acrid bite of gunpowder that lingered in the stagnant air. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, imported into the heart of the legislature. He looked down at Perceval. The young MP who had knelt beside the body was now rocking back on his heels, his hands covered in red, staring at them as if they belonged to a stranger. The blood had stopped flowing, pooling in the crevices of the flagstones, dark and thick. "He is gone," Vaughan said, his voice hollow. He stood beside Smith, shaking so violently his coat tails fluttered. "My God, William, he is truly gone." Smith could not speak. His tongue felt too large for his mouth, heavy and useless. He watched as 2 footmen arrived with a stretcher, their faces pale and grim, moving with the efficient solemnity of undertakers. They lifted Perceval with a gentleness that seemed grotesque given the violence of his end. The body sagged, the head lolling back, the eyes still fixed on the ceiling where the shadows danced in the draught. As they carried the Prime Minister away, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, leaving a wide, empty circle around the stain on the floor. No one stepped into it. They circled the blood as if it were plague, as if the very stone had become infectious. Bellingham, still pinned against the pillar, watched the body disappear through the doors of the chamber. He did not blink. He did not pray. He merely smoothed the front of his waistcoat, which had been rumpled in the scuffle, and waited. "The Luddites," Vaughan muttered, the word tumbling out in a rush of panic. "This is it, Smith. This is the signal, for the North has risen, and they are everywhere." Smith turned to look at his colleague, seeing the terror widening Vaughan's eyes, the way his mind scrambled to fit this singular, catastrophic act into a narrative he could understand. A lone merchant, broken by debt and neglect, did not fit the pattern. A conspiracy did. A mob did. "No," Smith said, his voice raspy. He pointed a trembling finger at the man in the blue coat, who was now being searched by a magistrate, surrendering papers from his pocket with calm cooperation. "Look at him, Vaughan. There is no mob. There is only him." "But the unrest," Vaughan insisted, his hand seizing Smith's lapel as he spoke of the machines and the starvation, declaring this the spark that would burn them all. Smith pulled free, his gaze returning to the blood on the floor. It was drying now, turning from bright scarlet to a dull, rusty brown. The clock in the corner ticked on, indifferent and steady, marking the seconds since the world had changed. 5:15. The time would be recorded in history books, etched into memory, but in this room it was just the sound of time passing over a corpse. "He asked for nothing," Smith whispered, more to himself than to Vaughan. "He simply waited." The magistrate finished his search and nodded to the guards holding Bellingham. "Take him to the sergeant-at-arms," he ordered, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. "Secure him, irons if you have them." Bellingham offered no resistance as he was marched towards the exit, his steps measured and precise. As he passed Smith, he paused for a fraction of a second. His eyes met Smith's, and in that brief contact, Smith saw no madness, no wild fanaticism. He saw only a profound, exhausting relief, the look of a man who has finally delivered a message that no one wanted to hear. "My grievance is settled," Bellingham said quietly, so softly that only Smith and Vaughan could hear. Then he was gone, swept out into the corridor by the guards. The lobby remained, filled with men who suddenly looked very old and very small. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on them all. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath, the pause before the scream of a nation realizing it was vulnerable. Smith looked down at his boots. A single drop of blood had spattered the toe of his left shoe, a tiny, dark star against the black leather. He stared at it, unable to move, unable to wipe it away. "Come," Vaughan said, tugging at his sleeve again, his voice brittle as he urged that they must secure the chamber. "We must assume there are others." Smith let himself be led, his legs moving automatically, but his mind remained fixed on the spot where Perceval had fallen. The blood was still wet, the smoke still hung in the air, and somewhere in the distance, the first church bell began to toll, a slow, mournful sound that seemed to count down the hours until the hangman's drop. The game had changed. The rules were gone. And as Smith stepped over the stain, he knew with a cold, sinking certainty that the fear Vaughan felt to the fear of 1,000 Luddites storming the Gatza was a distraction. The true danger had already walked out the door, wearing a blue coat and carrying a receipt for his own soul. The real work was just beginning. The crack split the air, sharp as a linen sheet torn by a giant's hand, and the world did not stop. It stuttered. Smith turned, the motion clumsy, his neck stiff from hours of bending over petitions, just as Spencer Perceval's stride broke. The Prime Minister did not cry out. He did not clutch his chest in the theatrical manner of the stage. He simply folded, knees buckling under the sudden removal of structural intent, collapsing onto the unforgiving stone flags with a wet, heavy thud that echoed louder than the pistol shot itself. A bloom of crimson spread across the white waistcoat. It was not a trickle. It surged, a violent, dark flower opening with shocking speed against the pristine linen, soaking into the fabric until the weave could hold no more and the excess began to pool on the grey stone. The colour was wrong, too bright, too alive against the dull, dusty hues of the lobby. Smith's breath hitched, a ragged gasp that tasted of sulphur and old dust. He lurched forward, his boot slipping slightly on the runner carpet, the friction burning the sole of his foot. Around him, the lobby erupted, but not into a roar. It was a fractured scramble, a discordant symphony of shouted questions and the scuffing of heels as men recoiled, then surged forward, trapped between the instinct to flee and the duty to assist. "Perceval," someone screamed, the name cracking mid-air. Smith reached the body first, or perhaps he was merely the closest of the frozen. He dropped to one knee, the hard stone biting through his trousers, and hovered his hand over the Prime Minister's chest. He wanted to press down, to stem the flow, to apply the pressure one might use on a wounded soldier in the field, but his fingers halted an inch above the fabric. The heat radiating from the wound was visceral, a shocking warmth that seemed to pulse against his palm, defying the cold dampness of the room. He could see the life draining from Perceval's eyes, the focus dissolving into a milky, unseeing stare fixed on the high, shadowed ceiling where the oil lamps guttered in the draught. It was futile. The realization hit Smith with the force of a physical blow, a cold stone dropping into his gut. There was no aid to be given here. The machinery of the man had stopped. "Stand back," a guard shoved past Smith, his elbow connecting hard with Smith's ribcage, knocking the wind from him. "Give him air." Air, the lobby was thick with it, heavy with the scent of wet wool drying on frantic bodies and the acrid bite of the pistol's discharge, a smell like burnt matches and rotten eggs that clung to the back of the throat. Smith scrambled backward, stumbling into the press of legs, his heart hammering a erratic rhythm against his ribs that felt too loud, too desperate. Near the pillar, the chaos had a different texture. 3 men had pinned a figure against the stone. John Bellingham. He offered no resistance, no struggle, no frantic attempt to flee into the shadows of the corridors. He stood rigid, his arms wrenching behind his back as the guards twisted them, his face pale but composed, terrifyingly lucid amidst the shouting. "Murderer," a voice shrieked from the edge of the crowd, high and thin with hysteria. "Cut him down." Bellingham did not flinch at the threat. He watched the guards fumble with his coat, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if he were being delayed by a tedious customs official rather than seized for high treason. His eyes scanned the room, skipping over the writhing form of the Prime Minister, ignoring the spreading pool of blood that now reflected the flickering candlelight like a dark mirror. "My grievance is settled," Bellingham said. The words were quiet, yet they cut through the din with surgical precision. They were not the ravings of a madman in the throes of a fit. They were stated with the calm finality of a merchant closing a ledger. Smith froze, his hand still hovering near his own chest, feeling the phantom warmth of Perceval's blood. Settled. The word hung in the air, absurd and horrific. What grievance could be settled by this? By the extinguishing of the nation's leader on the floor of his own house. The logic was impenetrable, a closed loop that excluded the screaming crowd, the weeping clerks, the very reality of death. "Silence him," the sergeant-at-arms bellowed, rushing forward, his face flushed with a fury that masked his own trembling hands. "Drag him away to the cells." They hauled Bellingham forward. He walked willingly, his steps measured, adjusting his stride to match the rough handling of his captors. As they passed Smith, the assassin's gaze swept over him. For a fraction of a second, their eyes locked. Smith expected to see hatred or fanaticism or the wild gleam of a Jacobin zealot. He found nothing, only a profound, exhausting relief. The look of a man who has finally delivered a message that no one wanted to hear, and who no longer cared whether it was received. Then he was gone, swept through the doors into the darker corridor, leaving the lobby to its own unraveling. The body of Spencer Perceval was lifted. 4 men struggled under the weight, the Prime Minister's head lolling back, his limbs dangling with a grotesque looseness that spoke of absolute stillness. They carried him towards the Speaker's chambers, leaving a wide, empty circle around the stain on the floor. No one stepped into it. They circled the blood as if it were plague, as if the very stone had become infectious. Smith remained on his knees, the rough texture of the carpet scraping his shin. He looked down. A single drop of blood had spattered the toe of his left boot, a tiny, dark star against the black leather. He stared at it, unable to move, unable to wipe it away. The coppery scent was stronger now, mingling with the sulfur, creating a nauseating perfume that coated the tongue. "The Luddites," Vaughan muttered, the word tumbling out in a rush of panic as he crouched beside Smith, his face grey and slick with sweat. "This is it, Smith. This is the signal. The North has risen. They are everywhere." Smith turned to look at his colleague, seeing the terror widening Vaughan's eyes, the way his mind scrambled to fit this singular, catastrophic act into a narrative he could understand. A lone merchant, broken by debt and neglect, did not fit the pattern. A conspiracy did. A mob did. "No," Smith said, his voice raspy, sounding as though it belonged to a stranger. He pointed a trembling finger at the empty space where Bellingham had stood. "Look at him, Vaughan. There is no mob. There is only him." "But the unrest," Vaughan insisted, grabbing Smith's lapel, his fingers digging into the wool. "The machines, the starvation, this is the spark. They will burn us all." Smith pulled free, the movement sharp, angry. He stood, his legs shaking, and looked down at the blood on the floor. It was drying now, turning from bright scarlet to a dull, rusty brown, losing its vitality even as the room continued to spin. The clock in the corner ticked on, indifferent and steady, marking the seconds since the world had changed. 5:15. The time would be recorded in history books, etched into memory, but in this room, it was just the sound of time passing over a corpse. "He asked for nothing," Smith whispered, more to himself than to Vaughan. "He simply waited." The magistrate finished his search of the area where Bellingham had stood and nodded to the guards. "Take his papers," he ordered, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. "Secure everything, irons if you have them." The lobby remained, filled with men who suddenly looked very old and very small. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on them all. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath, the pause before the scream of a nation realizing it was vulnerable. Smith looked at the blood on his boot again. It seemed to pulse in the dim light. "Come," Vaughan said, tugging at his sleeve again, his voice brittle, close to breaking. We must secure the chamber. We must assume there are others. The Luddites will be at the gates within the hour." Smith let himself be led, his legs moving automatically, but his mind remained fixed on the spot where Perceval had fallen. The blood was still wet, the smoke still hung in the air, and somewhere in the distance, the first church bell began to toll, a slow, mournful sound that seemed to count down the hours until the hangman's drop. But as they moved towards the safety of the chamber doors, a whisper rippled through the gathering crowd, passed from mouth to ear like a contagion. The Luddites, the signal, the insurrection. The fear took root instantly, feeding on the shock, twisting the solitary act into the vanguard of an army. Smith felt the shift in the room, the collective pivot from grief to paranoia, and he knew with a cold, sinking certainty that Vaughan's fear was already becoming the truth they would all have to fight. The true danger had walked out the door, wearing a blue coat, but the nation would hunt a ghost instead. The real work was just beginning. The drop landed. Smith flinched, a reflexive jerk of the shoulder as if struck, though the crimson bead had merely settled onto the toe of his boot, joining the earlier spatter in a dark, coagulating cluster. He stared at it, unable to look away, the stain expanding slightly as the leather absorbed the fluid, turning the polished black into a thirsty, porous sponge. Around him, the lobby ceased to be a corridor of state and became a slaughterhouse floor, the air thick with the reek of burnt tallow and the sharp, metallic tang that coated the back of the throat. Men surged forward, then recoiled, a tide of black coats and white breeches ebbing and flowing around the stillness of the Prime Minister's form. "Make way," a voice cracked, high and brittle, belonging to a clerk who shoved past Smith with an elbow sharp as a bone. "Give him air, for God's sake." "There is no air here," Smith muttered, the words tasting of ash. He tried to step back to find solid ground, but his heels slipped on the runner carpet, sending him lurching sideways into the press of bodies. Hands grabbed him, steadying him, or perhaps holding him back. He could not tell the difference between aid and restraint. "Stand fast, Smith," Vaughan hissed, his grip iron-tight on Smith's upper arm, fingernails digging through the wool of the coat. "Do not faint. We cannot have you collapsing beside him. Not now." "I am not collapsing," Smith said, wrenching his arm free, the movement clumsy and uncoordinated. "I am looking." He forced his gaze upward, past the circle of trembling legs, to where Perceval lay. The Prime Minister was no longer the architect of war, the leader of the Commons, the man who had held the fragile coalition together with sheer, exhausting will. He was a sack of grain tipped onto the flags, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, one eye open and staring at the vaulted ceiling with a look of mild, bureaucratic surprise. The white waistcoat, pristine only moments before, was now a ruined map of red, the fabric soaking up the life with a speed that defied belief. It spread outward, a slow, blooming flower of violence that ignored rank, ignoring the dignity of the office to stain the stone beneath. Smith's hand moved of its own accord, reaching out towards the fallen man. He intended to check for a pulse, to offer some final sacrament of touch, but his fingers halted inches from the chest. The heat radiating from the wound was visible in the shimmering air, a visceral warmth that spoke of engines still running, of a body fighting a battle it had already lost. To touch it would be to admit the reality of the end, to cross the threshold from witness to participant in this grotesque tableau. He withdrew his hand, curling the fingers into a fist against his own thigh. "He is gone," someone said. The voice was flat, devoid of grief, merely stating a fact like the price of grain. "Shot through the heart, instant." "Instant," Vaughan laughed, a short, jagged sound that bordered on hysteria, insisting that nothing is instant, man. "Look at him, he is fighting. Can you not see it?" Perceval was not fighting. His chest rose once, a shallow, rattling intake of breath that sounded like dry leaves skittering on stone, and then settled. The struggle was internal, a silent extinguishing of the flame that had driven the Empire for so long. Smith watched the stillness claim the limbs, the tension draining from the shoulders until the arms lay limp against the sides, palms open in a gesture of sudden, absolute surrender. The grandeur of the state had evaporated, leaving only meat and bone on a cold floor. A surge of movement broke the circle. Guards, their faces flushed with exertion and fear, dragged the assassin back towards the center of the room. Bellingham walked between them, his feet shuffling slightly on the stones, but his posture remained erect, almost rigid. He did not struggle. He did not shout. He looked at the body of Perceval with the detached interest of a merchant inspecting a damaged shipment, his expression unreadable, stripped of triumph or regret. "Justice," Bellingham said. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into a well, heavy and final. "My grievance is settled." "Grievance," Vaughan spat, stepping forward, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You call this justice? You mad fool, you have plunged us into chaos. Do you know what you have done?" Bellingham turned his head slowly, fixing Vaughan with a gaze that was terrifyingly lucid. There was no madness there, no frothing rabidity of the Jacobin zealot the House feared. There was only a profound, exhausting clarity, the look of a man who has balanced his ledger and found the sums correct. "I petitioned," Bellingham said, his voice quiet but carrying effortlessly over the hushed room. "I wrote and I waited, yet they would not hear me, so I made them hear." "He is a Luddite," a voice whispered from the edge of the crowd, sharp and terrified. "A signal, The North has risen. No, Smith said, the word tearing from his throat before he could stop it. He pushed forward, stumbling over the hem of his coat, driven by a desperate need to correct the record before the lie took root. Look at him. He stands alone. There is no army. There is no signal. There is always an army, Vaughan snapped, grabbing Smith's shoulder again, shaking him. Do not be naive, William. One shot does not make a revolution, but the fear of it does. They will use this. The government will use this to crush every loom in Lancashire. Can you not see? Smith shook him off, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He looked back at Bellingham, who was now being forced to his knees by the guards, the rough hands yanking his arms behind his back. The assassin did not resist. He simply watched the blood on the floor, his eyes tracing the edges of the stain as it ceased to spread, darkening to a rusty brown as the life within it cooled. Secure him, the sergeant-at-arms ordered, his voice trembling with a rage that masked his own terror. Take him to the cells, irons, double locks. They hauled Bellingham away, his boots scraping against the stone, leaving no mark, no trace of his presence other than the smoke hanging in the air and the hole he had punched through the heart of the nation. The crowd parted for them, a sea of black coats splitting to let the prisoner pass, eyes averted from the blood, from the body, from the truth of what had just occurred. Smith stood alone in the widening circle, the cold stones seeping through the soles of his shoes. The scent of sulphur was fading, replaced by the cloying sweetness of the tallow candles and the underlying coppery stench of the spill. He looked down at his boot again. The blood had dried completely now, a hard, dark scab on the leather. He tried to scrape it off with his heel, but it held fast, a permanent brand of the afternoon. The Luddites, Vaughan whispered again, the word losing its meaning through repetition, becoming a chant, a prayer, a curse. They will be at the gates. We must bar the doors. There are no Luddites here, Smith said, his voice hollow, sounding as though it came from a great distance. Only us, only this. But the whisper was already spreading, rippling through the lobby like a virus, passing from mouth to ear, twisting the solitary act of a broken merchant into the vanguard of a phantom army. Men were backing away, hands reaching for canes, for swords, for anything that could serve as a weapon against the invisible horde they now believed was storming the halls. The fear was tangible, a physical weight pressing against the chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Smith watched them, the men of power reduced to frightened children in the dim light, and felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, heavier than the grief, sharper than the shock. They would not hunt the man who had fired the shot. They would hunt the ghost Vaughan had named. They would tear the country apart looking for a conspiracy that did not exist, while the real dangerer, the quiet, singular despair of a man ignored her, walked freely out the door, leaving the nation to bleed itself dry in the dark. The church bell tolled again, slow and mournful, counting the seconds until the hangman's drop. But in the lobby, the only sound that mattered was the frantic scratching of a quill as a clerk began to write the first lie of the new era. The quill scratched, a dry, insectile rasp against paper that drowned out the breathing of 40 men. Smith watched the clerk's hand, the knuckles white, the nib digging into the fiber of the sheet as if trying to anchor the room against a tide that had already swept them out to sea. Ink bloomed black and wet, a fresh wound on the page mirroring the one cooling on the flags. Spencer Perceval, deceased. The words took shape under that frantic pressure, permanent before the body had even stopped twitching. Move him, someone commanded, not the sergeant, a voice from the back, thick with the need to erase the evidence. Get him out of sight. 2 footmen, faces grey as the stone beneath them, stooped to lift the Prime Minister. They grabbed under the arms, under the knees, heaving the dead weight upward with a grunt of effort that sounded obscenely human in the hallowed silence. The head lolled back, neck broken by gravity, the chin resting against a collar now stiff with drying claret. Blood dripped from the hem of the coat, a slow, rhythmic plip, plip, plip onto the stones as they carried him towards the Speaker's apartments. It marked their path, a dotted line of crimson leading away from the scene of the crime, vanishing into the shadows of the corridor where the light from the lobby candles could not reach. Smith did not move. His feet felt rooted to the spot, the dried scab on his boot grinding into the grit of the floor. Clear the floor, the sergeant barked, though his authority had fractured, splintering into 1,000 nervous shards. "Everyone back, give them air." "There is no air left to give," Vaughan muttered, leaning heavily against a pillar with his hand pressed to his mouth as if holding in bile. His eyes, wide and unseeing, fixed on Smith. "God help us, William." The mob would be here within the hour, for they would have heard the shot and known the head was cut off. "The mob is in Manchester," Smith said, the words tasting of ash, "and the mob is in Nottingham, but there is no mob here, Vaughan, only us." "Does it matter?" Vaughan's laugh was a short, jagged sound devoid of humor, for fear makes its own armies. "You know this, having preached on it yourself. When men are terrified, they see ghosts in every shadow, and right now, every shadow looks like a pike." Smith turned away from him, unable to bear the panic radiating from the other man like heat from a furnace. He looked instead at the space where Perceval had fallen. It was empty now, save for a dark, widening pool that reflected the guttering yellow of the nearest candle. The flame danced in the draught, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the flags, reaching for the walls like grasping fingers. A group of MPs huddled near the entrance, their heads bent together, voices dropped to a conspiratorial hiss. Smith caught fragments as the air shifted, carrying the smell of unwashed bodies and damp wool over the metallic tang of blood. "French agents." "No, the Luddites." "Signal for general insurrection." "Burn the mills." The lie was taking hold. It spread faster than the truth ever could, feeding on the hunger for a pattern, for a reason that made sense of the absurdity. A lone merchant, slight and precise in his blue coat, did not fit the narrative of chaos. A coordinated uprising did. A foreign plot did. Men clung to the complexity because the simplicity was too terrible to endure, that the state could be brought to its knees by a single, ignored petition. Smith stepped towards the huddle, the impulse to correct them rising in his throat again, but he stopped. What use was the truth? It was a small, fragile thing against the swelling tide of their terror. They wanted a conspiracy. They needed an enemy they could fight, a faceless horde to justify the soldiers they would soon call out, the suspensions of liberty they would soon enact. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, not from cold, though the chill of the stone seemed to be rising through the soles of his shoes, numbing his ankles, creeping up his calves. He clenched them into fists, the nails digging into his palms, trying to force stillness into the bones. "Mr. Smith." He turned. A young clerk, face pale and slick with sweat, stood holding a stack of papers. The boy's eyes were fixed on the bloodstain, unable to look anywhere else. "The petition, sir," the boy whispered, holding out the top sheet. "From the weavers. You asked me to keep it safe." Smith stared at the paper. It was clean, white, untouched by the violence that had just consumed the room. The names of the starving men in the north were listed there in neat, hopeful columns, appealing to the very man who now lay cooling in the next room. "Put it away," Smith said, his voice rough. "Burn it." "So." "Burn it," Smith repeated, louder this time, drawing the attention of the huddled group. "It is useless now, all of it, every word." The boy flinched, clutching the papers to his chest as if they were a shield, and scurried backward into the shadows. Smith leaned against the wall, the cold stone biting through his coat. The lobby was emptying now, the men fleeing towards the safety of the streets or the illusory security of their carriages, leaving behind only the stains and the smell. The candle nearest to him sputtered, the wick drowning in its own melted fat, casting the corner into sudden, deep darkness. In that gloom, the whisper started again, louder this time, confident. "They say the signal was given." A voice drifted from the doorway, belonging to a man Smith did not recognize, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword he had no business wearing inside the Commons. "The mills in Lancashire are already burning." This was just the start. Smith closed his eyes. The image flashed behind his lids, not mills burning, but Bellingham's calm, clear eyes as he spoke of redress, the singular, terrible logic of it. "It wasn't a signal," Smith said to the empty air, his voice barely audible over the scratching of the clerk's quill, which had never stopped, recording the death, recording the lie, recording the end of the world as they knew it. It was a receipt. But no one heard him. The whisper had become a roar in their minds, a phantom drumbeat of revolution marching towards London, and there was no power left in the room to stop it. The clerk dipped his pen again, the inkwell running low, the scratch becoming a scrape, a desperate grating sound that filled the silent lobby, counting down the seconds until the hangman's drop, until the trial, until the nation tore itself apart chasing a ghost, while the real killer waited, patient and unrepentant, in the dark. Smith pushed himself off the wall. He had to move. He had to get out before the panic solidified into policy, before the fear turned into law. But as he stepped towards the door, his foot slipped on the edge of the bloodstain, the dried crust cracking under his weight, and he stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe, looking back one last time at the empty space where the Prime Minister had died. The candle flickered and died, plunging the spot into total darkness. The air in the committee room did not circulate, it stewed. A thick, yellowish haze of tobacco smoke and the sour, animal reek of wet wool clung to the velvet drapes, trapping the heat of 40 agitated men within walls that had seen quieter, more civilized disputes over turnpike tolls and canal rights. Here, the noise was different. It possessed a jagged, frantic edge, like the screech of metal on stone. Habeas corpus must go, tonight. Lord Sidmouth slammed a palm against the mahogany table, the impact sending a tremor through the inkwells. Dark fluid jumped the rims, bleeding into the grain of the wood like fresh wounds. He did not wipe it away. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, scanned the room as if expecting the wainscoting to split open and disgorge a battalion of Jacobins. "You cannot suspend the great writ on a whisper, Henry," Smith said. He kept his voice low, forcing the words to travel through the smoke without rising to a shout. "We have one man in custody, one merchant with a grievance, not an army." One man, Viscount Castlereagh spun from the window, where he had been peering out into the grey twilight that pressed against the glass. His face was pale, the skin drawn tight across his cheekbones, giving him the look of a skull wrapped in parchment. One man does not walk into the lobby of the House of Commons with a loaded pistol unless he knows the guard is withdrawn, unless he knows the signal has been given. The guard was not withdrawn, Smith countered, shifting his weight on the hard wooden chair. His hip joint ached, a dull throb that seemed to sync with the pounding of the blood in his temples. It was a rotation, a matter of routine. Bellingham knew the routine because he has been haunting these corridors for weeks. He is not a revolutionary, he is a litigant who has lost his mind. A litigant does not shoot the Prime Minister. The shout came from the back of the room, a younger MP, fresh from the universities, his cravat askew, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigar. The flint of the striker sparked, a tiny, violent flash in the gloom before dying. He cursed, throwing the useless implement onto the table. It rolled, clattering against Sidmouth's spilled ink. "Look at the north," Sidmouth pressed, leaning forward, his breath smelling of stale brandy and fear. "The letters from Manchester, the reports from Nottingham. The frames are being smashed as we speak. The Luddites are not merely breaking machines, Smith. They are testing the resolve of the magistracy. They are waiting for the head to fall in London to raise the pike in the provinces. If we do not act with absolute severity now, if we do not show them that the state is iron, we will wake tomorrow to find the tower in flames." Smith rubbed his temples. The friction generated heat, a useless warmth against the cold dread settling in his gut. He wanted to tell them that fear was a poor counselor, that panic bred the very chaos they sought to avoid. But the room was no longer a place of debate. It was a cage of echoing anxieties, each man feeding the terror of the next, until the fiction of a grand conspiracy felt more solid, more real, than the solitary, broken man sitting in a cell nearby. "The suspension," Sidmouth declared, turning to the clerk who sat hunched over a ledger, quill poised like a dagger. "Draft the order. Immediate suspension of habeas corpus in the northern counties. Authorization for magistrates to detain without warrant. We shall call it the Safety of the Kingdom Act." "It is tyranny," Smith muttered, though the words were lost in the sudden murmur of assent that rippled through the gathered Tories. "You are giving them exactly what they claim we are. You are making the tyrant real." A knock at the door shattered the momentum. The room froze. Every head snapped towards the heavy oak panels, 40 pairs of eyes widening in a collective spasm of paranoia. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Sidmouth barked, Enter. The door creaked open. A footman, looking decidedly smaller than he had that morning, stepped inside. He held a folded sheet of paper in a hand that trembled visibly. His livery, usually crisp, was spotted with mud, as if he had run the entire way from the postal sorting office. "A dispatch, my lord," the footman stammered, keeping his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "From Mr. Hargreaves in Stockport, arrived by special rider not 10 minutes past." Sidmouth snatched the paper. He broke the seal with a thumb that lacked any finesse, tearing the wax and the edge of the parchment alike. He unfolded the sheet, his eyes scanning the lines rapidly. The silence in the room grew heavy, pressing against the eardrums, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the acrid bite of the tallow candles that guttered in the draught. Sidmouth's face went slack. Then, a slow, grim satisfaction settled over his features, terrifying in its calmness. "Read it," Castlereagh demanded, his voice a sharp crack. Sidmouth looked up, his eyes locking with Smith's. There was no triumph there, only a somber validation of every worst nightmare. "The mills at Midgley are ash," he read, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "The mob has seized the magistrate's court. They speak of a signal from London. They say the tyrant is dead and the work begins." A collective exhale swept the room. It sounded like a deflation, the release of tension that immediately hardened into resolve. "You see," Sidmouth folded the paper, the sound crisp and final, "it is not a lone madness. The spark has caught. The fire is already burning." Smith felt the air leave his lungs. He knew Hargreaves, a reliable man, prone to exaggeration but never to fabrication. If the mills were burning, the panic had outpaced the truth. The shot in the lobby had not caused the uprising, but the rumor of the shot had. The distinction was vital, intellectual, and utterly useless in this room. The reality of the North was tinder-dry. The assassination was merely the match dropped into the straw. "We must ride," Castlereagh said, already moving towards his coat hanging by the door. "The guards must be mobilized, every available musket." "And Bellingham?" someone asked from the shadows. "Hang him," Sidmouth said, without hesitation, without a flicker of mercy. "Hang him before dawn if the law can be bent that far. Make an example. Let the North see the price of regicide." They began to move then, a flurry of coats and hats and swords, the committee dissolving into a task force of suppression. Smith remained seated, an island of stillness in the rushing current. He watched them go, these men who believed they were saving the kingdom by dismantling its liberties. He thought of the weavers in Stockport, starving and desperate, their looms silenced not by politics, but by hunger, now to be crushed under the heel of a state terrified of its own shadow. The room emptied quickly, leaving only the smoke and the spilled ink. Smith stood, his legs stiff, his joints protesting the movement. He walked to the window, pressing his hand against the cold glass. Outside, London was disappearing. A fog had rolled in from the Thames, thick and yellow, swallowing the street lamps and muffling the sound of carriage wheels. It was a physical weight, a damp blanket that obscured the world, turning familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes. He could not let them act on this alone. If Bellingham was merely a madman, as Smith believed, then the narrative of a grand conspiracy was a lie that would cost lives. Thousands of lives. The suspension of rights, the military occupation of the North, the execution, sir, it would all be built on a foundation of sand. He needed to see the prisoner. The thought formed with sudden, crystalline clarity. He needed to look into Bellingham's eyes again, to hear the man speak without the filter of panic or the distortion of rumor. He needed to know if there was a plot, or if there was only the terrible, solitary arithmetic of a man who believed he had been wronged. Smith turned from the window. He adjusted his coat, smoothing the lapels with hands that had stopped trembling. The fog outside was dense, impenetrable, but he would walk through it. He would walk to the cells, past the guards, past the hysteria, to find the one truth that remained in this city of lies. He blew out the candle on the table, plunging the room into darkness, and stepped out into the corridor, the smell of blood still lingering faintly on the stone, guiding him towards the heart of the shadow. The corridor swallowed him whole. Darkness, thick and cloying, pressed against his eyes the moment the committee room door clicked shut behind him. No lantern burned here. The footmen had fled with their masters, leaving the passage to the mercy of the gloom that seeped up from the Thames and settled in the cracks of the masonry. Smith reached out, his fingers brushing the cold stone wall, rough as a file under his palm. He moved forward one step, then another, the soles of his boots making no sound on the runner carpet that had been laid down for the session. It felt wrong, this silence. The building usually hummed with the low drone of clerks, the shuffle of papers, the distant shout of a division bell. Now nothing, just the drip of water somewhere in the depths, a rhythmic plip that counted out seconds like a dying watch. He paused, his breath hitched in his throat, sharp and shallow. "Who goes there?" The voice sliced through the dark, rough with fear and authority. A guard stepped from a recess near the staircase, a halberd gripped tight in white-knuckled hands. The man's face was a pale oval in the gloom, eyes wide and darting, sweeping his gaze across the shadows for the mob that Sidmouth had promised was coming. "It is Smith," he said, his own voice sounding thin, stripped of its usual parliamentary weight. "William Smith, member for Sudbury." The guard lowered the weapon an inch, though he did not relax his grip. "Mr. Smith, you should be inside, sir, with the lords. They are saying the Jacobins are at the gates." "The gates are empty, Thomas," Smith lied, stepping closer until the smell of the man's sweat cut through the damp air. "There is no army, only a madman in a cell." "Madman or no, the orders are to hold the passages, no one in or out without the Home Secretary's seal." Thomas shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking loudly in the stillness. "Especially not down to the holding cells, that area is locked tight. Castlereagh's order." Smith felt a flare of irritation, hot and sudden in his chest. "Castlereagh is busy burning the north to save the south. I require access to the prisoner Bellingham, immediately." "Can't do it, sir." With a jerky, nervous motion, the guard shook his head. "Keys are with the sergeant at arms, who has gone to the armory because he said we need muskets for the lobby." "The lobby is secure." "Is it?" Thomas leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "I heard them talking, sir, in the pantry. Said Bellingham wasn't alone. Said there's a second wave coming to finish the job, maybe to free him." Smith stared at the man. The absurdity of it tasted like bile. A second wave, to free a merchant who had walked calmly into the trap and snapped it shut on his own ankle. The panic had metastasized, spreading from the committee room down into the bones of the servants, turning rational men into children frightened of bogeymen. "There is no second wave," Smith said, keeping his voice level, forcing the authority back into his tone. "And if you keep me from him, you leave the Prime Minister's death unexplained. Do you want that on your conscience when the King asks why we hang the wrong men?" The guard flinched. The mention of the King, of ultimate accountability, struck a nerve deeper than any order from Castlereagh. He looked down at his boots, then back at Smith, conflict warring in his tired eyes. "I can't give you the keys, Mr. Smith." But he hesitated, glancing towards the shadowed archway that led to the lower stairs. "The side door to the cells, the one the coal men use, is bolted from the inside, yet the latch is broken. It has been for months, if you knew the trick of it." "Show me." Thomas didn't move his feet, but he jerked his chin towards the left. "Past the statue, down the service stairs, don't take a light. The sentry down there is jumpy as a cat. He might shoot first and ask later." "Thank you, Thomas." Smith moved before the man could change his mind. He skirted the edge of the runner, his shoulder grazing the cold stone wall as he navigated the turn. The air grew heavier here, the scent of wet wool and candle smoke replaced by the damp, earthy smell of the river foundation mixed with something sharper. Urine, fear, the metallic tang of old iron. He found the service stairs, a narrow spiral of stone that descended into the belly of the palace. He took them slowly, counting the steps to keep his mind from racing. 12, 15, 20, the darkness absolute, save for a faint, grayish luminescence filtering down from a grate high above, likely the street level. It illuminated nothing, only making the shadows seem deeper, more substantial. At the bottom, a heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, just as the guard had hinted. Smith pushed it open. It groaned, a low, complaining sound that echoed sharply in the confined space of the corridor below. He froze, waiting for the challenge, the click of a musket cocking, the shout of alarm. Nothing. He slipped through the gap. The corridor here was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from a hook near the far end, its flame guttering in a draught that smelled of salt and sewage. 2 cells lined the wall. The first was empty, the straw on the floor scattered and trampled. The second held a figure sitting on a wooden bench, hands resting on his knees, staring at the opposite wall. John Bellingham. He looked exactly as he had in the lobby, composed, tidy, terrifyingly ordinary. His blue coat was brushed free of dust, his cravat still perfectly knotted. There was no sign of the struggle, no blood on his cuffs, no madness in his posture. He looked like a clerk waiting for a coach that was running late. Smith stepped into the circle of light. The floorboards creaked under his weight. Bellingham turned his head. His eyes met Smith's, clear and focused. There was no surprise there, no fear. "Mr. Smith," Bellingham said. His voice was quiet, devoid of inflection, yet it carried perfectly in the small space. "I wondered if someone from the opposition might come, though I expected Mr. Burdett, perhaps, or Lord Cochrane." "They are busy arming the city against a phantom," Smith replied, stopping 3 paces from the cell door. The iron bars were cold, gleaming dull in the lantern light. "They believe you are the vanguard of a revolution. They say the North is in flames because of you." Bellingham blinked, a slow and deliberate movement. "The North are the mills." He nodded slightly, as if filing the information away in a ledger. "That is unfortunate, but not my concern, for my grievance was with the Chancellor and the government's refusal to hear my petition regarding Russia, nothing more." "Tell them that," Smith urged, gripping the cold iron of the cell door. His knuckles whitened. "Tell Sidmouth, tell Castlereagh, if you do not clarify this, they will use your act to crush the weavers. They will hang men who had no part in this. They will suspend the habeas corpus and rule by decree." Bellingham shifted on the bench, crossing one leg over the other. He looked at Smith with an expression that might have been pity or perhaps just mild boredom. "Why should I care for the weavers, Mr. Smith? They did not suffer my injustice, nor did they petition for 6 years only to be ignored and fobbed off with platitudes while my family starved." Leaning forward until the light caught the sharp line of his jaw, he declared, "I did what I had to do, the rest is noise. Let them burn if they must. Since it is the government's doing and not mine, I merely provided the punctuation." Smith felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was it, the truth, not a conspiracy, not a grand design, but a singular, selfish arithmetic that counted only one life as real. Bellingham would not help him. He would not speak to soothe the fears of a nation. He was satisfied. The transaction was complete. "You are a fool," Smith whispered, the words escaping before he could check them. "A solitary, arrogant fool." "Perhaps," Bellingham agreed softly, yet he remained a fool who was finally heard. A heavy thud echoed from the stairs above, followed by voices and shouting, while the clatter of boots on stone rang out. "They are coming," Smith said, stepping back into the shadows. "The guard said they would shoot." "Let them," Bellingham replied, turning his gaze back to the blank wall. "The deed is done. The rest is merely administration." Smith turned and ran. He slipped back through the broken latch, up the spiral stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He burst into the upper corridor just as a squad of guards rounded the corner, muskets raised, bayonets fixed. "Halt," the sergeant barked, leveling his weapon at Smith's chest. Smith threw his hands up, breathless, the taste of Bellingham's apathy still sour on his tongue. The truth was worse than the lie. There was no conspiracy to debunk. There was only a madman who didn't care, and a government desperate to believe in a plot so they wouldn't have to face the terrifying randomness of the act. "I have been below," Smith gasped, lowering his hands slowly. "I have seen him. There is no plot, no second wave, only him." The sergeant hesitated, the musket wavering. Behind him, the corridor filled with more men, their faces grim, eyes hard with the belief that they were hunting wolves. "Take him," a voice commanded from the rear, belonging to Castlereagh. He ordered them to secure the MP and double the guard on the prisoner, for they would move him to Newgate within the hour. Smith was seized by rough hands, his coat twisted in their grip. He didn't resist. He looked past the sergeant, down the dark throat of the corridor where he had just left the truth sitting quietly on a wooden bench. It wouldn't matter what he said. The machine was already turning, grinding the facts into the shape it needed to survive. As they dragged him towards the committee room, Smith realized with a sinking dread that the real danger wasn't the assassin in the cell. It was the men with the muskets, convinced they were saving the world by destroying it, and he was alone in the fog with them. The door to the committee room flew open, striking the wainscot with a crack that severed the shouting inside. Smoke hung in the air, thick and yellow, a physical weight that coated the throat and strung the eyes. It smelled of burnt tallow, damp wool drying on heated bodies, and the sharp, acrid tang of fear sweat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. 20 men sat around a long table scarred by ink stains and the nervous carving of penknives. Faces flushed crimson under the guttering candles. Hands slapped wood. "Jacobins!" cried Lord Sidmouth, his voice cracking on the high note. He stood at the head of the table, clutching a sheaf of papers as if they were a shield against a mob. "It is the signal. The shot in the lobby was the tocsin. By dawn, the pikes will be out in Spitalfields. The mills in Lancashire will be ash. Habeas corpus must go," another voice boomed, deep and guttural. Castlereagh pacing the length of the rug, his boots thudding a rhythmic, anxious beat. "Suspension, indefinite. We cannot wait for proofs when the house is already burning. Hang the ringleaders from the lamp posts if we must. Order must be restored before the French hear of it." Smith stumbled as the guards released him, his coat wrinkled, his breath still jagged from the sprint up the stairs. He gripped the back of an empty chair to steady himself. The room swam. The faces turned towards him, eyes wide, pupils dilated in the gloom, seeing not a colleague but a carrier of plague. "There is no rising," Smith said, his voice sounding thin and reedy against the roar of panic as he pushed off the chair to step into the circle of light. "I have spoken to him, Bellingham. There are no others, no committee, and no signal." "Lies," Sidmouth spat the word, slamming his hand on the table so hard the inkwells jumped. "You are duped, Smith, or worse, a sympathizer. The man is a tool, nothing more, a puppet cut loose once the deed was done. Do not speak to me of solitude when the very air vibrates with treason." "It is not treason," Smith insisted, raising a hand in a gesture that felt as futile as a moth batting against a lantern. "It is madness, a private grievance. He spoke only of Russia, of debts unpaid, for he cares nothing for the weavers or your revolution." "Then why does the North burn?" The question came from the corner, quiet and deadly. A clerk, young and pale, held up a slip of paper. The hand that held it trembled. "Read it," Castlereagh commanded. He stopped pacing. The silence that rushed in to fill the gap was heavier than the shouting had been. The clerk cleared his throat. "Sir, the frame breakers have returned to Radford. 3 mills fired last night. The magistrates flee. They cry out for Perceval's blood, though he is dead. They say the tyrant falls, now the machines follow. They march on Nottingham. God save us." The ink on the note was smudged, a dark blur where a thumb had pressed too hard in haste. It looked like a bruise. Smith felt the floor tilt. The words hung in the smoke, twisting the truth into a shape he could not recognize. The timing was a coincidence, a cruel alignment of separate miseries, but in this room it became proof. The Luddite unrest, months in the making, unrelated to the man in the cell below, now fused with the assassination in the fevered minds of the government. The spark had landed in the tinder, and no amount of shouting about dry wood would stop the blaze. "You see," Sidmouth whispered, sinking back into his chair. He looked suddenly old, the skin beneath his eyes gray and slack. "The machine is in motion. We must act, tonight." "But they are not connected," Smith pleaded. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, feeling the vibration of the men's trembling legs through the wood. "The man below told me himself. He would not lift a finger to save a weaver. He is alone." "Then he is a liar as well as a murderer," Castlereagh said. He picked up a quill, dipped it into the ink with deliberate slowness. "Or he is a fool who thinks his silence protects accomplices who do not exist. It matters not. The effect is the same. The people believe it is a conspiracy, and in politics, belief is the only reality that holds weight." Smith straightened. The argument was circular, a snake eating its own tail. Reason had no purchase here. The fear was too visceral, too hungry. They needed a monster to fight, a shadowy cabal to justify the iron fist they so desperately wished to clench. A solitary, slighted merchant did not justify the suspension of liberty. A grand Jacobin plot did. He looked around the table. These were men of law, of logic, of centuries of parliamentary tradition. Now they huddled like children in a storm, inventing ghosts to explain the thunder. "If you suspend the habeas corpus on this lie," Smith said, his voice dropping low and hard, "you do what the assassin could not. You destroy the Constitution. You give them the revolution they claim to fear." "Better a broken constitution than a dead state," Sidmouth muttered. He signed the paper. Castlereagh slid across the table. The scratch of the nib sounded like a bone snapping. Smith stepped back. The air in the room felt suffocating, recycled too many times through panicked lungs. The candlelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for him. He could not stay. To remain was to be complicit, to nod while they dismantled the very freedoms he had spent a lifetime defending. He turned and walked to the door. No one stopped him. They were too busy drafting the warrants, too busy saving the world from a fire that existed only in their own reflections. The corridor outside was cooler, the stone leaching the heat from his boots. Smith walked without direction, his footsteps echoing on the flags. He passed the guardroom where the muskets leaned against the wall, the bayonets gleaming dull and sharp. He passed the clerks running with bundles of fresh parchment, their faces set in masks of grim importance. Down the stairs, out into the night. The fog had thickened. It pressed against the palace walls, a damp grey blanket that swallowed the light of the torches. Smith pulled his coat tight, the wool scratching his neck. The air tasted of coal smoke and the river, low tide exposing the mud and the rot beneath. He walked towards the gate, the gravel crunching under his feet. The streets beyond were unnaturally quiet. The usual rattle of hackney carriages was absent, replaced by a muffled stillness. Groups of men stood in the doorways of shops, heads bowed together, voices hushed. They did not look at him as he passed. They looked past him, into the fog, watching for shapes that might emerge. A woman pulled a child closer to her skirts as Smith approached, her eyes wide and unblinking. A shopkeeper drew the shutters halfway down, the wood groaning on its hinges, leaving only a slit of darkness to peer through. The city was holding its breath, waiting for the blow that would not come, waiting for the mob that was not marching. Smith stopped at the edge of the pavement. The fog curled around his ankles, cold and insistent. He thought of Bellingham, sitting on his bench in the dark, satisfied with his singular, terrible arithmetic. He thought of Sidmouth, signing away liberties to fight a ghost. And he thought of the weavers in the north, who would hang for a crime they did not commit, victims of a coincidence twisted into conspiracy by the terror of men in power. The truth was a small, fragile thing. It could not stand against this. It would be crushed, trampled under the heavy boot of necessity. Unless... Smith turned back towards the palace, where the guards at the gate watched him, hands resting on their pikes. He ignored them. His gaze drifted towards the dark wing where the cells were held, though the visit had been forbidden and the guards held orders to shoot. Castlereagh believed the matter settled. But Bellingham was the only one who knew the whole of it, the only one who could speak the words that might pierce the hysteria, if only they could be recorded, witnessed, made undeniable before the rope was tightened. If Smith could get back down, if he could force a confession onto paper, signed and sealed before the hangman's call, not to save Bellinghammer, that cause was loster, but to save the others, to break the link between the shot and the rising before it hardened into history. He adjusted his collar, feeling the damp chill seep through to his skin. The guards were watching. The fog was thick enough to hide a man if he moved with care. Smith stepped off the pavement and into the shadow of the wall. He would not go home. He would not sleep. He would go back down into the dark, to the man who did not care, and he would make him care if it was the last thing he did. The sergeant on duty did not raise his musket, though his thumb rested heavy on the lock. He smelled of stale beer and the sour damp of a coat worn too long in the rain. "I require the box," Smith said. His voice scraped against the quiet of the guardroom, rougher than he intended. "The one taken from the prisoner's person, the letters." "Lord Sidmouth's orders are plain, Mr. Smith. No access, not until the magistrates convene at dawn." "Sidmouth is busy drafting the end of liberty. I need 5 minutes with the paper before he buries it under treason." Smith stepped closer, ignoring the bayonet that drifted an inch towards his waistcoat. "Do you know what happens when a government fights a ghost, Sergeant? It starts killing shadows. I will not have innocent blood on my hands because I lacked the spine to look at a ledger." The sergeant shifted his weight. The leather of his belt creaked, a sharp, dry sound in the muffled room. He looked at the door behind Smith, then back at the MP's grey, rain-slicked hair. The man knew the name. Everyone in Westminster knew the dissenting minister who argued until his throat bled. 2 minutes, the sergeant muttered. He jerked his chin towards the antechamber, a sliver of space partitioned off by a screen of dark oak. "And if the Home Secretary asks, I saw nothing. You broke in. I was securing the perimeter." "Understood." Smith moved past him, the air in the small room thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and wet wool drying on human bodies, a scent that clung to the stone like a second skin. He pushed through the oak screen. The antechamber was barely 6 feet square, lit by a single tallow candle that guttered in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for the papers stacked on the narrow table. He sat, the chair groaned under his slight frame. The box sat open. Inside lay a chaotic spill of documents, receipts for cloth, a passport stamped with Cyrillic characters, and a stack of letters tied with a fraying piece of blue ribbon. Smith's hands trembled as he reached for the top letter. The paper felt coarse, cheap stuff, the kind a merchant uses when the good stock has run out and pride must yield to necessity. "To His Excellency, the Ambassador, St. Petersburg, 14th October 1804. Smith read the date. 8 years. The ink was faded, the script precise, each loop of the G and tail of the Y executed with a meticulous care that spoke of a man trying to impose order on a world spinning into chaos. "I remain, sir, your most obedient servant, John Bellingham." He turned the page to find another petition, dated 1805, then 1806, as the stack grew taller under his fingers like a physical stratigraphy of neglect. Each letter was a variation on the same theme: imprisonment without cause, the seizure of goods, the refusal of the British Embassy to intervene. The tone never rose to shouting, nor did it scream of Jacobin fervor or Luddite rage. It was calm, logical, and terrifyingly reasonable. "The laws of Russia are harsh, yet the silence of my own country cuts deeper than any chain." Smith ran a finger over the words. The fiber of the paper roughened under his nail. He could feel the cold of that Russian cell seeping through the years, a clammy chill that had nothing to do with the May evening outside. This was not the ranting of a madman. It was the ledger of a merchant who had balanced his books and found the state in debt to him, a debt unpaid. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. 3 years prior, a ship's captain had stood in this very lobby, begging for assistance after being impressed by a French privateer and abandoned by the Admiralty. Smith had listened. He had nodded. He had promised to raise the matter in the House. And then the session had ended, and the war had demanded attention, and the captain's name had slipped from his mind like water through a sieve. How many captains? How many merchants? How many silent men sitting in foreign jails, writing letters that landed in baskets marked file and were never seen again? Smith picked up another sheet. This one was a draft of a letter to the Prime Minister himself, dated only a month ago. "If justice is denied, I must seek it where it may be found. The life of a subject is the property of the Crown, but when the Crown refuses to protect that property, the subject reclaims his own agency." The candle flared, the flame stretching thin and blue before settling back into a yellow glow. Smith's breath hitched. He saw the line clearly now, a direct thread stitching the bureaucratic indifference of 1804 to the bloody stone of the lobby floor. They had not created a monster. They had manufactured a weapon. They had taken a man who believed in the rule of law, shown him that the law was a fiction for the poor, and waited for him to snap. And now Sidmouth wanted to call it a conspiracy. They wanted to say it was France, or the Luddites, Anything but the rot in their own house. Smith grabbed a fresh sheet of parchment from the pile beside the box. He dipped the quill into the inkwell. The black liquid shimmered, viscous and deep. He began to write, the nibs scratching nervously on the paper, a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding in his chest. Memorandum: the evidence suggests no co-conspirators. The motive is singular, born of personal grievance regarding Russian detention. To suggest a wider plot is to ignore the documentary record now in our possession. We risk inflaming the North with accusations of treason when the true culprit is our own delay. He stopped. The ink pooled at the end of the sentence, a dark, wet eye staring back at him. If he signed this, if he presented it to the cabinet tomorrow, they would tear it apart. They would call him a sympathizer, a traitor. They would say he was soft on regicide, and perhaps they would be right. Perhaps there was a part of him that understood the terrible, mathematically perfect logic of Bellingham's despair. But if he did not sign it, the machine would roll on. The arrests would begin. Men would hang in the North for a crime they did not commit, killed by a narrative Smith had the power to disrupt, but chose to let stand. His hand hovered over the bottom of the page. The candle sputtered, sending a wisp of acrid smoke into the air. The silence of the room pressed in, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the distant toll of a church bell marked the hour, the sound muffled by the fog, counting down the moments until the trial, until the hanging, until the history books were written by the victors. He could not do it. The pen felt like lead. His flaw, that crippling, polite indecision that had stalled a dozen bills in committee, seized his throat. He could not stand against the tide, not alone. With a sharp exhale, he pushed the memorandum aside. It lay there, unsigned, a silent accusation in the dim light. He would not save the weavers, not tonight. He turned back to the box, needing to be sure, needing to find the one piece of paper that would make the truth undeniable, even if he lacked the courage to wield it. His fingers dug to the bottom of the stack, beneath the petitions and the receipts, until they brushed against a single, folded sheet of plain paper, sealed with no wax. He broke the fold. The handwriting was different here, less formal. The loops were jagged, the pressure of the pen tearing the paper in places. I do this alone. No man urged me. No society employs me. It is my own hand and my own wrongs. Smith stared at the words. The confession was absolute. It was the key that could unlock the prison of paranoia gripping the government. And as he sat there, listening to the footsteps of the guards pacing outside the screen, he knew with a sinking certainty that when the sun rose, this letter would be dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic, and the hunt for the phantom army would begin in earnest. The ink on that final declaration had not even dried before the world outside. The room began to rewrite it. Smith let the paper fall. It landed soft against the wooden table. A white flag surrendered to a war no one else believed was being fought. He rubbed his thumb across the grain of the desk, feeling the roughness of unpolished oak, the same texture that had grounded 1,000 boring committee meetings on grain tariffs and turnpike repairs. Now it felt slippery, greased by fear. Mr. Smith. The voice came from the door, thin and reedy, cutting through the thick air of the antechamber. Smith jumped, his elbow knocking the inkwell. A drop of black splashed onto his cuff, blooming instantly into a dark, jagged star. He looked up. A clerk stood in the doorway, holding a lantern that cast long, dancing shadows against the wainscoting. The boy's face was pale, washed out by the yellow glow, his eyes wide with the kind of frantic energy that comes from running messages between rooms where men are shouting. Lord Sidmouth requires the box, sir, the clerk said, stepping forward but stopping short of the threshold, as if the air inside were contaminated. The cabinet is assembled. They say the French ambassador has been seen conferring with a known radical in Cheapside. Smith stared at him. The absurdity of it hit him like a physical blow, a slap across the face from a ghost. Cheapside, he repeated, his voice sounding hollow, stripped of authority. At this hour, in this fog. The report is confirmed, sir, or rather, it is being treated as confirmed. The clerk shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the floorboards. They wish to prepare the warrant for general arrests before morning. They need the evidence of correspondence to link the merchant to the French cell. Smith looked down at the box. It sat open, a wooden mouth filled with the truth. Inside lay the receipts for bread bought in Archangel, the petitions stamped rejected by the Foreign Office, the lonely, logical screeds of a man who had waited 6 years for an answer that never came. There was no French cipher here, no code, no secret society meeting in a tavern, only the mundane, crushing paperwork of a life dismantled by bureaucracy. "There is no link," Smith said. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, a harsh shriek that made the clerk flinch. "There is no French cell, there is only this." He gestured to the papers, a sweeping movement that nudged the unsigned memorandum slightly askew. "Read it yourself, boy. Glance at the last page, where he states it plainly, he acts alone." The clerk did not move towards the desk. He kept his distance, his grip tightening on the lantern handle until his knuckles turned white. "I cannot read it, sir. Lord Sidmouth said only to collect the box. He said you might be too close to the matter to see the larger pattern." Too close, the words hung in the air, acrid as the tallow smoke. Smith felt a coldness spread through his chest, distinct from the damp chill of the building. It was the cold of exclusion. They had already decided. The narrative was set, the architecture of the panic constructed beam by beam while he sat here playing with letters. They needed a monster to justify the blood they intended to spill in the north, and a lonely, broken merchant did not fit the mold. A French plot did. A Jacobin uprising did. "You will tell them," Smith said, stepping around the desk. His legs felt heavy, as if the stone flags below were pulling at his bones. "You will tell the Home Secretary that I have examined the documents, that there is no conspiracy, that to claim otherwise is a lie." The clerk took a step back, the light from the lantern swinging wildly, throwing the shadows of the room into a chaotic dance. "I am to bring the box, sir, not a message, especially not that message." The boy's voice dropped to a whisper, terrified of being overheard by the walls themselves. "They are speaking of suspending habeas corpus before the week is out, sir. They say the shot was a signal. If I go back with words that contradict the signal, I shall be the one in the dock." Smith stopped. He looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw the tremor in his hands, the sweat beading on his upper lip despite the cold. This was the machine, not the grand gears of state, but the small, frightened cogs that turned it, terrified of stepping out of line, terrified of being ground down. He thought of the weavers in Nottingham, men who broke frames because they could not feed their children, men who would now be rounded up, tried, and hanged for a French plot that existed only in the fevered minds of ministers who needed a scapegoat for their own failures. And he thought of Bellingham, swinging at Newgate in a week's time, his own singular grievance swallowed whole by the roar of a manufactured war. Smith reached out and closed the lid of the box. The sound was final, a dull thud that echoed in the small room. He picked it up. It was heavier than he expected, weighted down not just by paper, but by the silence he had just chosen to keep. "Very well," Smith said. His voice was flat, devoid of the passion that had burned in his throat moments before. "Take it." He handed the box to the clerk. The boy grabbed it quickly, eager to have the burden in his own hands, eager to be gone from this room where the truth sat so heavily in the air it was hard to breathe. Will you be coming to the chamber, sir?" the clerk asked, hoisting the box against his hip. "The debate begins within the hour." Smith looked at his cuff, at the black stain of ink that had spread while he hesitated. It looked like dried blood. "No," he said, "I have a headache. The fog agrees with me poorly tonight." The clerk nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and backed out of the room. "Good night, Mr. Smith." "Good night." The door clicked shut. The latch fell into place with a soft, definitive snap. Smith was alone again. The silence rushed back in, filling the space the clerk had occupied, pressing against his ears. He walked to the window, the glass cold under his palm. Outside, the fog had thickened, a swirling grey mass that obscured the street lamps and muffled the sounds of the city. He could see nothing but the immediate swirl of vapor against the pane, a perfect metaphor for the blindness that had just descended upon the government. He pressed his forehead against the glass. The cold seeped into his skin, sharp and clarifying, but it brought no relief. Below, somewhere in the unseen streets, The carriages would be rolling towards Whitehall. The ministers would be gathering, their faces grave, their minds already made up. They would open the box, perhaps glance at the papers, and then set them aside as the ravings of a madman, focusing instead on the phantom Frenchman in Cheapside. And he would be in his study, pouring a glass of wine, telling himself that he had done what he could, that he had seen the truth, that seeing was enough. A lie. He turned from the window and walked back to the table. The unsigned memorandum still lay there, the ink pooled at the end of the sentence like a wound that would not scab over. He picked it up, the paper stiff and cool. For a second, he considered folding it, putting it in his pocket, taking it home to burn in the fire where no one would ever see it, to destroy the evidence of his own cowardice. Instead, he smoothed it out. He dipped the quill again. The nib hovered over the blank space below his name, trembling slightly. He did not sign it. He blew out the candle. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint, grey glow of the fog outside the window, a weak illumination that revealed nothing and hid everything. Smith stood in the dark, listening to the distant, muffled tolling of the bells, counting the seconds until the trial, until the hanging, until the history books were written by the victors, and the truth was buried under the weight of a necessary lie. The door handle turned slowly, inch by inch, as if someone on the other side was testing whether the lock had truly caught, or perhaps waiting to see if the man inside would finally find the courage to open it again. The roar hit him first, a physical wall of sound that battered the ears before the doors even opened. Smith stood on the threshold of the great hall, shoulders hunched against the press of bodies surging towards the courtroom entrance. Heat rose. It curled off the crowd in visible waves, distorting the candlelight that flickered in the sconces along the stone walls. "Make way, member passing." Smith did not shout. He lacked the breath for it. Instead, he lifted his cane, tapping the ferrule hard against the flagstones, a sharp click that cut through the din for a second before the noise swallowed it whole. A man in a greasy waistcoat stumbled back, spilling ale from a tin cup onto Smith's boot. "Watch your step, sir," the man muttered, though he did not move aside. He smelled of onions and stale tobacco, a pungent cloud that lingered in the narrow space between them. "Move," Smith said. His voice was low, stripped of the cadence he used in the Commons, reduced to a command suitable for a street brawl. The man glanced at the cut of Smith's coat, the somber black wool that marked him as something other than a pickpocket or a curiosity seeker, and shuffled left. Smith squeezed through the gap, ribs brushing against the rough fabric of a stranger's jacket. The air inside the courtroom hung heavy, a solid thing composed of exhaled breath and the sour damp of coats worn too long in the rain, pressing against the lungs until each inhalation felt like a negotiation. He found a spot near the back, wedged between a pillar and a woman whose bonnet obscured his view until she sat. Dust motes danced in the shafts of grey light leaking from the high windows, settling on the heads of the clerks below who shuffled papers with a frantic, dry rustling. 4 days. Only 4 days since the lobby floor turned red, yet the machinery of the law had already greased its wheels for the killing. "Cramped in here," a voice said beside him. Smith turned. A man with a florid face and a quill tucked behind his ear leaned in, eyes bright with the sick excitement of a man attending a hanging without the weight. "Ventilation is poor," Smith replied. "They say he'll hang Friday," the man whispered, leaning closer, his breath hot against Smith's cheek. "Quick work. Castlereagh wants it done before the riots spread." "There are no riots," Smith said. He kept his eyes on the judge's bench where the candles guttered in the draught. "Only rumors." "Riots start with rumors, sir. You know how it is in the north," the man said, nudging Smith's elbow to seek camaraderie in the morbidity. "Best to be rid of the fellow. Bad blood needs letting." Smith did not answer. He looked down at the dock. It was empty, a wooden box stained dark by the hands of 100 previous prisoners waiting to receive the next. The wood looked smooth, worn down by friction and fear. He thought of the unsigned memorandum in his study, the ink still wet when he blew out the candle. That paper sat in the dark while this theatre prepared its finale. A bailiff struck the floor with a staff. The noise cracked like a whip. Silence in the court. The roar diminished to a murmur, then a restless shifting of feet. The crowd did not want silence, they wanted the spectacle. Smith gripped the head of his cane, his knuckles white against the polished wood. His left foot throbbed, the gout flaring in the damp weather, a sharp reminder of his own mortality amidst the state-sponsored death about to be enacted. He wondered, not for the first time since that Monday evening, whether the rush to judgment was born of a genuine desire for order or merely the panicked need to close a wound that threatened to bleed out the entire Constitution, a fear that gnawed at his gut more sharply than the hunger he had ignored since dawn. "Do you think he'll plead insanity?" the florid man asked again, unable to hold his tongue. "No," Smith said, "he will plead justice. Same thing in the end. Not to him." The side door opened. A hush fell, not the profound silence of grief, but the held breath of a crowd waiting for the lion to enter the pit. Bellingham walked in. He wore a blue coat, buttoned high, and his face was pale but composed, devoid of the tremors that shook the spectators in the gallery. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the judges. He walked to the bar and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, straight-backed as a soldier awaiting inspection. Smith felt a sudden, cold clarity. This was not a monster. This was a clerk, a merchant, a man who had written letters until his hand cramped and received nothing but silence in return. "John Bellingham," the clerk of the court announced, his voice droning through the stale air. "You stand indicted for the willful murder of Spencer Perceval." Bellingham nodded, a single sharp dip of the chin. "I am ready." The judge adjusted his wig, the horsehair stiff and white against the black robe. "We shall proceed." Smith shifted his weight, the pain in his foot spiking again. He looked around the gallery. Faces leaned forward, mouths slightly open, drinking in the procedure. They wanted blood to validate their fear, to prove that the chaos in the streets was the work of madmen rather than the failure of ministers. He felt sick. The smell of the crowd intensified, a mix of unwashed linen and anticipation that coated the back of his throat. "Look at him," the florid man whispered, "cold as ice." "He is not cold," Smith said. "He is finished." "What difference does it make?" "It makes every difference." Smith turned away from the man, focusing on the prisoner. Bellingham was speaking now, his voice clear and steady, outlining the grievances that had led him to the lobby. He spoke of Russia, of debt, of petitions ignored. He spoke like a man reading a ledger, balancing accounts that the state had refused to acknowledge. Smith listened. The words were rational. The logic was sound, twisted only by the conclusion that a bullet was the only currency left to him. The judge interrupted, steering the narrative back to the act itself, away from the cause. The legal machinery ground forward, gears oiled with haste. "Enough," the judge said, waving a hand. "The facts are not in dispute." "But the reasoner," Bellingham started. "The reason is irrelevant to the charge." Smith closed his eyes for a second. The unsigned memorandum burned in his mind. He had chosen silence then, fearing the instability it might cause. Now, watching the state crush a single man to preserve the illusion of control, he understood that the silence was the weapon, not the pistol. The pistol had merely shattered the glass. The clerk began to read the indictment again, faster this time, rushing towards the verdict that everyone knew was already written, when Smith opened his eyes. Bellingham was looking up, though not at the judge and not at the jury. He was looking at the gallery. His gaze swept the rows of faces, past the florid man, past the women in bonnets, until it landed on Smith. For a heartbeat, the noise of the court fell away. There was no accusation in the prisoner's eyes, only a weary recognition, as if he knew exactly who Smith was, knew about the study, the candle, the unsigned paper. Smith did not look away. He could not. The hook of that gaze caught him, holding him in place, while the verdict approached like a falling blade. The clerk's voice rose, a dry rattle of parchment and procedure, stripping the nuance from Bellingham's ledger until only the blood remained. "Guilty," the foreman said. No hesitation, no deliberation. The word dropped into the room like a stone hitting the bottom of a dry well, final and hollow. A murmur rippled through the gallery, not of shock, but of satisfaction, a collective exhale from hundreds of lungs that had been holding the same breath since Monday. The florid man beside Smith let out a sharp grunt, nudging his neighbor as if they had backed a winning horse at Newmarket. "There," he hissed, leaning close enough for Smith to smell the onion on his breath. "Told you, quick work. Justice serves the king well." Smith said nothing. He gripped the head of his cane until the wood bit into his palm, the pain a small, sharp anchor in a room that felt suddenly unmoored. The speed of it sickened him. 4 days. 4 days from the shot in the lobby to this wooden box, this rushed recitation of facts, this preordained conclusion. They were not trying a man, they were cauterizing a wound. The state needed the bleeding to stop, needed the narrative to close, needed the monster to be hanged before the people in the streets realized that monsters wore blue coats and spoke with the quiet reason of clerks. Bellingham did not flinch. He stood straighter, if such a thing were possible, his hands still clasped behind his back, his posture rigid against the weight of the verdict. He looked at the judge, then at the jury, his expression unreadable, a mask of calm that seemed to mock the frantic haste of the court. "I have no objection to the verdict," Bellingham said, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the room without effort. "But I must object to the haste. My life is forfeit, I accept that, but my character remains. You hang a murderer today, you do not hang a madman. There is a distinction." "The distinction is irrelevant to the law," the judge snapped, his patience fraying like an old rope. He shifted in his high chair, the silk of his robes rustling loud in the sudden quiet. "You have been afforded every opportunity to present your defense. The jury has heard the evidence. The law is clear. Stand down." "But the petition, sir," Bellingham started, his voice rising for the first time, a crack in the porcelain. "The neglect, the years in Archangel, the debt, if I had been hearder." "You were heard," the judge interrupted, his voice booming now, drowning out the prisoner. "You were heard in the lobby of the House of Commons with a pistol in your hand. That is the only hearing that matters to this court. The rest is history, the rest is grievance, and grievance is not a defense against murder." A cold knot tightened in Smith's stomach, for the judge was right legally, even as the room felt morally like an abattoir where they slaughtered truth to save the Constitution. Bellingham's grievance was real. Having seen the papers and heard the whispers in the corridors of power about the merchant's ruined life, Smith knew the diplomatic failures and the sheer, grinding inertia of a bureaucracy that had ignored a man until he broke. Yet here, in this theater of justice, none of that mattered because the narrative had to be simple. A madman killed a great leader, so the madman dies and order is restored. The Luddites in the north would see the hangman's rope and think twice, while the mob in the streets would see the swiftness of the law and fear it. It was a performance, and they were all actors. "John Bellingham," the judge intoned, standing up. The black robes fell around him like a curtain, obscuring the man beneath. "You have been found guilty of the willful murder of the Right Honourable Spencer Perceval, Chancellor of the Exchequer and First Lord of the Treasury. The sentence of this court is that you be taken from this place to the prison from which you came, and thence to a place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy on your soul." The words hung in the air, heavy and sulphurous, mixing with the smell of the crowd. A gasp went up from the women in the front row, a performative swoon of horror that masked their voyeuristic thrill. The men nodded, grim and satisfied. The machine had worked. The gear had turned. The blood debt was paid. Smith watched Bellingham. He expected anger. He expected despair. He expected the mask to slip, to reveal the terrified animal beneath the rational clerk. But Bellingham did nothing. He simply nodded once, a small, precise movement of the head, as if acknowledging a receipt for goods delivered. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. His eyes swept his gaze across the gallery, moving past the gaping mouths, the bonnets, the flushed faces of the city's curious. They moved past the florid man, who was now wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. They moved past the empty spaces where the truth should have been, and they stopped. On Smith. The connection was instant, electric, a wire strung tight across the crowded room. Bellingham's eyes were dark, deep pools of exhaustion that held no hate, no plea for mercy. They held only a terrible, quiet recognition. He knew Smith. Not personally, perhaps, but he knew the type. He knew the man who sat in the Commons, who read the petitions, who saw the machinery of neglect and chose to look away, who prioritized the stability of the state over the justice of the individual. He knew that Smith was complicit, not in the murder, but in the conditions that made it inevitable. Smith froze, his breath caught in his throat, a physical blockage that made his chest ache. He wanted to look away, to drop his gaze to the floor, to the cane, to anywhere but those eyes, but he couldn't. The gaze pinned him, holding him accountable in a way the law never could. In that look, Smith saw the unsigned memorandum on his desk. He saw the silence he had kept. He saw the easy path of order chosen over the difficult path of truth. Bellingham held the gaze for a second, two, three, long enough for Smith to feel the weight of it, the judgment of a man who had nothing left to lose. Then, slowly, Bellingham's lips curved, not a smile, not a smirk, just a twitch of the mouth, a ghost of an expression that said, "You see, you finally see." The bailiffs moved in, grabbing Bellingham by the elbows, rough hands on the blue coat, dragging him away from the bar, away from the judge, away from the gallery. Bellingham went willingly, his feet shuffling on the wooden floor, his head still turned towards Smith, until the crowd surged forward, blocking the view, a wall of bodies and bonnets and hungry faces. "Did you see that?" the florid man exclaimed, turning to Smith with a face flushed by excitement as he cried out against the villain who had looked right at them without a shred of shame. Smith did not answer. He could not. The noise of the court rushed back in, a roar of voices, the scraping of chairs, the shouting of bailiffs, the weeping of the dramatic. But it sounded distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. The image of those eyes burned behind his own, bright and accusing in the gloom of the Old Bailey. He leaned heavily on his cane, his leg trembling, the gout forgotten in the face of a sharper pain. The crowd began to disperse, flowing out into the grey afternoon, eager to spread the news, to feast on the details of the trial, to prepare for the spectacle of the hanging on Friday. They wanted a story of madness and evil. They wanted a monster. Smith pushed against the flow, stumbling slightly as a woman in a yellow bonnet bumped into him, muttering an apology without looking back. He needed air. He needed to get out of this room, away from the smell of unwashed bodies and the taste of ash. He needed to escape the memory of that look, the silent accusation that had stripped him bare. He reached the door, pushing it open with his shoulder, stepping out into the corridor where the light was dim and the air cooler. The noise of the court faded behind him, replaced by the echo of footsteps on stone. He walked slowly, dragging his bad leg, each step a labor. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the street, turning the world into a blur of grey and shadow. Carriages waited in the rank, their wheels muffled by the damp cobbles, the horses standing still, steam rising from their flanks in the cold air. The city waited. The execution was set for Friday. The date was fixed. The machinery was oiled. Smith stopped at the edge of the pavement, looking out into the mist. He thought of Newgate. He thought of the drop. He thought of the silence that would follow the snap of the rope. And he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like lead, that the silence would not bring peace. It would only bring more questions, more ghosts, more unsigned memorandums left to rot in the dark. He turned his collar up against the damp, stepping off the curb into the fog. He had to go home. He had to find that paper. He had to write. But as he walked, the image of Bellingham's eyes followed him, a lantern in the gloom, lighting the way to a truth he was no longer sure he wanted to find. The clerk's voice sliced through the murmur, flat and final. Guilty. No pause, no deliberation. The jury had been out less time than it took to brew a pot of tea, perhaps less than the time required for a man to walk from the dock to the holding cell. They filed back in, faces blank, eyes avoiding the prisoner who stood perfectly still at the bar, his hands clasped behind his back, as if awaiting a carriage rather than a death sentence. Justice, swift, efficient, an administrative function performed with the same brisk indifference as stamping a passport or tallying a customs ledger. Smith gripped the railing before him, his knuckles whitening against the dark, polished wood. The gallery creaked under the shifting weight of 300 spectators, a collective exhalation of disappointment that the spectacle had ended so abruptly. They had come for drama, for the unraveling of a madman, for the delicious horror of a soul being flayed before the law. Instead, they received a formality, a rubber stamp. John Bellingham, the recorder intoned, his voice booming off the damp stone walls, amplified by the acoustic architecture designed to project authority. You stand convicted of the willful murder of the Right Honourable Spencer Perceval, Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister of this realm. Bellingham nodded, once precise. He adjusted the cuff of his blue coat, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle. "I hear the court," he said, his voice carried, clear and steady, lacking the tremor of fear or the rasp of despair. "And I maintain my plea. The act was justified. The government refused me redress. I was left no other avenue. The law does not recognize private grievance as license for assassination," the recorder snapped, cutting through the logic before it could take root in the minds of the crowd. "Your defense has been heard and found wanting. There is no mitigation in the delusion of persecution." Delusion, the word hung there heavy and convenient. It wrapped the complex tangle of Russian prisons, lost cargo, ignored petitions, and years of bureaucratic silence into a neat, pathological package. If it was madness, then the system remained sound. If it was madness, then the machine had not failed. Only the man who fell into its gears had been broken. Smith felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck, distinct from the damp chill of the room. He looked at the faces around him. The florid man beside him was already reaching for his hat, eager to be first out the door to carry the news to the coffee houses of Fleet Street. A woman in a grey shawl dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether for Perceval or the sheer theatricality of the moment, Smith could not say. They wanted the monster. They needed the monster. It kept the world orderly. "The sentence of this court," the recorder continued, the rhythm of the words practiced, rehearsed, a liturgy of state power, "is that you be taken hence to the place from whence you came, and thence to the common jail of Newgate, where you shall remain until Friday next, the 18th day of May." Friday, 4 days. The timeline locked into place, immutable as the stone of the court itself. No stay of execution, no appeal to the king's mercy, not that such mercy would be granted in a climate terrified of Luddite fires and Jacobin pikes. The government needed blood to quell the rumor of insurrection. They needed the narrative closed before the northern mills could use this single shot as a signal to burn the rest of the country down. "And there," the recorder's voice rose, pitching for the back of the gallery, "you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul." A murmur rippled through the crowd, satisfied, the equation balanced, a life for a life, order restored. Bellingham did not flinch. He did not pray. He did not collapse. He simply turned his head slowly, sweeping his gaze across the tiers of the gallery with the detached curiosity of a man inspecting a warehouse inventory. His gaze passed over the gaping mouths, the bonnets bobbing like corks in a tide, the men jotting notes in pocketbooks. It swept past the empty spaces where truth might have sat, had there been room for it in this theatre. Then it stopped. On Smith. The connection snapped taut, a wire drawn tight across the smoky air, and Smith's breath hitched in a jagged intake that tasted of stale air and fear. He tried to look away, straining to focus on the judge's wig or the candle guttering in the draught, even on the cane clutched in his white-knuckled hand, but he could not. The eyes held him. Dark and exhausted, they were devoid of hate and devoid of fear, holding only a terrible, quiet recognition. Bellingham knew him, not the man, perhaps, but the type. The man of principle who sat in the Commons, who read the petitions, who saw the gears of the machine grinding men into dust and chose to do nothing because the machine must not stop. The man who valued the stability of the realm over the justice of the individual. "You see," the look said, "we are both prisoners here." Smith froze, his chest ached, a physical blockage that made his lungs feel too small for his body. The accusation in that gaze was heavier than any verdict the court could pronounce. It stripped away the layers of parliamentary procedure, the polite fictions of debate, the comforting illusion that they were men of reason governing a rational world. In those eyes, Smith saw the unsigned memorandum on his desk. He saw the silence he had kept when the names of the imprisoned were read out. He saw the easy path of order chosen over the difficult path of truth. Bellingham held the gaze for a second, 2, 3, long enough for Smith to feel the weight of it, the judgment of a man who had nothing left to lose. Then, slowly, Bellingham's lips curved, not a smile, not a smirk, just a twitch of the mouth, a ghost of an expression that said, "You see, you finally see." The bailiffs moved in, rough hands grabbing the blue coat at the elbows, breaking the line of sight. They dragged Bellingham away from the bar, away from the judge, away from the gallery. Bellingham went willingly, his feet shuffling on the wooden floor, his head still turned towards Smith until the crowd surged forward, a wall of bodies and bonnets and hungry faces blocking the view completely. "Did you see that?" the florid man exclaimed, turning to Smith, his face flushed with excitement, sweat beading on his upper lip. "The villain, looking right at us. No shame, not a shred of shame." Smith did not answer, he could not speak. The noise of the court rushed back in, a roar of voices, the scraping of chairs, the shouting of bailiffs, the weeping of the dramatic. But it sounded distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. The image of those eyes burned behind his own, bright and accusing in the gloom of the Old Bailey. He leaned heavily on his cane, his leg trembling, the gout forgotten in the face of a sharper pain. The crowd began to disperse, flowing out into the grey afternoon, eager to spread the news, to feast on the details of the trial, to prepare for the spectacle of the hanging on Friday. They wanted a story of madness and evil. They wanted a monster. Smith pushed against the flow, stumbling slightly as a woman in a yellow bonnet bumped into him, muttering an apology without looking back. He needed air. He needed to get out of this room, away from the smell of unwashed bodies and the taste of ash. He needed to escape the memory of that look, the silent accusation that had stripped him bare. He reached the door, pushing it open with his shoulder, stepping out into the corridor where the light was dim and the air cooler. The noise of the court faded behind him, replaced by the echo of footsteps on stone. He walked slowly, dragging his bad leg, each step a labor. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the street and turning the world into a blur of grey and shadow while carriages waited in the rank, their wheels muffled by the damp cobbles. The horses stood still, steam rising from their flanks in the cold air. The city waited. Although the execution was set for Friday and the date was fixed, the machinery was oiled. Smith stopped at the edge of the pavement, looking out into the mist. He thought of Newgate. He thought of the drop. He thought of the silence that would follow the snap of the rope. And he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like lead, that the silence would not bring peace. It would only bring more questions, more ghosts, more unsigned memorandums left to rot in the dark. He turned his collar up against the damp, stepping off the curb into the fog. He had to go home. He had to find that paper. He had to write. But as he walked, the image of Bellingham's eyes followed him, a lantern in the gloom, lighting the way to a truth he was no longer sure he wanted to find. Damp wool clung to Smith's neck, a cold, suffocating band that tasted of the river's low-tide breath. "Make way!" The command came from a guardsman whose bayonet caught the grey light, flashing a warning to the press of bodies. Smith stumbled, his cane skidding on the slick cobblestones as the crowd surged forward, a single heaving organism desperate for a view of the cart. He did not look at the soldier. He looked at the wheels. They were immense, iron-rimmed circles that crushed the mud and straw beneath them, muffled only slightly by the thick fog that draped the city like a burial shroud. Thousands lined the route from Newgate to the gallows, yet the noise was wrong. It lacked the baying hunger of a public holiday. There were no oranges tossed, no raucous songs about justice served, only a low, vibrating murmur that seemed to rise from the pavement itself. "Sir, you'll be crushed, sir." A woman in a bonnet stained with soot grabbed Smith's sleeve, her fingers digging into the fabric of his coat with a familiarity born of shared panic. She smelled of gin and wet ash. "I am quite steady," Smith lied, wrenching his arm free. "Pray let the procession pass." She did not let go, her eyes, wide and rimmed with red, fixed on the slow-moving dray horse pulling the condemned man's cart. "They say he smiled, sir, when they read the sentence. They say he asked for a glass of port." "Bellingham asked for many things," Smith muttered, the name tasting like bile in his mouth. "Few were granted." The woman released him, shrinking back into the wall of spectators as the cart lurched forward. The wood groaned under the weight of the coffin that waited at the end of the journey, a black box already secured to the scaffold's base. Smith forced his legs to move, stepping into the gap left by the retreating crowd. His gout flared, a sharp, twisting fire in his ankle that threatened to buckle his knee, but he locked the joint and pushed on. He had to see it. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because the trial 4 days prior had felt like a fever dream, a rushed pantomime where the verdict was written before the first witness swore the oath. The state required a conclusion. The streets required a body. A line of infantry marched alongside the cart, their boots striking the stones in a rhythmic hollow clap that echoed off the narrow tenements. Muskets were shouldered, bayonets fixed, the steel gleaming dully in the mist. They looked ridiculous. They looked terrified. The government had deployed half the garrison to guard a single, shackled merchant, acting as though the Luddite armies of the north were poised to burst from the fog and liberate the prisoner at any moment. Smith watched a young ensign, no older than 20, whose hands trembled so violently against his rifle stock that the weapon rattled. "Foolish display," Smith whispered to no one. "What's that?" A man in a leather apron leaned in, his breath hot and sour against Smith's ear. "You callin' the King's Guard foolish, mate, might get you hung alongside him." "I call it theatre," Smith said, his voice flat, devoid of the deference the moment demanded. "There is no army coming, friend. There is only one man on that cart, and he goes willingly enough." The man in the apron recoiled as if struck, glaring at Smith with a mixture of confusion and anger before turning back to the spectacle. The crowd parted further, revealing the cart in its entirety. Bellingham sat atop his own coffin, dressed in a suit of black that seemed too new, too stiff for the occasion. His hands were bound, but his posture was upright, rigid with a dignity that the trial had failed to strip from him. He did not look at the faces pressing in on either side. He stared straight ahead, through the fog, through the gates of the prison, towards the final geometry of the drop. Smith felt a sudden, violent urge to vomit. It was not the sight of death that turned his stomach, but the recognition of complicity. He had sat in the Commons while the whispers of conspiracy swirled like smoke, letting Vaughan and the others scream about Jacobin plots and French agents, knowing in his gut that the truth was far simpler and far more damning. Bellingham was not a signal for insurrection. He was a receipt. A physical manifestation of every petition ignored, every letter filed away, every grievance swallowed by the machinery of a state too weary to listen. The heavy military presence was not a shield against rebellion. It was a blindfold the government wore to avoid seeing its own reflection in the merchant's eyes. "God save the king," someone shouted, the cry thin and brittle, instantly swallowed by the damp air. No one answered. The silence returned, heavier than before, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. Even the horses seemed to sense the unnatural hush, their hooves clipping softly as they navigated the turn towards St. Sepulchre without Newgate. The church loomed out of the mist, its stone walls slick with condensation, the bell tolling a slow, mournful rhythm that matched the beating of Smith's own heart. One stroke for the sin, one stroke for the penalty, one stroke for the silence of the witnesses. Smith stumbled again, this time catching himself on the railing of the scaffold approach. The wood was wet, slimy with the touch of 1,000 hands. He climbed the steps, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps that burned his lungs. The platform was crowded with sheriffs and chaplains, men in black robes who spoke in hushed, urgent tones, checking ropes and testing traps with the clinical efficiency of butchers preparing a side of beef. "Mr. Smith." The chaplain, a thin man with spectacles fogged by the damp, stepped forward, blocking the view of the trapdoor. "You should not be up here, sir. The strain. It is not fit for a man of your constitution." "I am a member of Parliament," Smith said, brushing past the priest's outstretched hand. "I have a right to witness the law take its course." "The law is a harsh master today," the chaplain replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He refuses the sacrament. He says he has no sins to confess, that the Crown has not already pardoned by its own negligence." Smith stopped. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, echoing the accusation from the courtroom, the look that had stripped him bare. Negligence. The word hung in the air, more potent than the smell of the rope or the damp rot of the timber. "He is ready," the sheriff announced, his voice booming suddenly, cutting through the murmurs of the officials. "Bring him forward." Two turnkeys guided Bellingham to the center of the platform. The merchant walked without assistance, his steps measured and precise. He stopped at the edge of the drop, looking out over the sea of faces below. For a fleeting second, his gaze swept the platform and locked with Smith's. There was no triumph in those eyes now, no anger, only a profound, exhausting clarity. Bellingham nodded, a barely perceptible dip of the chin, an acknowledgement of the shared burden they now carried. The hangman stepped forward, the white cap in his hand. The crowd below held its breath, 1,000 lungs pausing in unison. The fog seemed to thicken, curling around the gallows like smoke from a dying fire. Smith gripped the railing, his knuckles white, the wood biting into his palm. He wanted to look away. He needed to look away. But he forced his eyes to remain open, to record the final mechanics of the state's retribution. The cap went over the black hair. The noose was adjusted, the hemp ruff against the neck. Bellingham did not flinch. He stood as still as the stone pillars of the Commons, a monument to a grievance that had finally found its voice. "Lord have mercy," the chaplain intoned, his voice trembling. The hangman moved to the lever. The iron groaned. Smith closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a reflexive flinch against the inevitable, and when he opened them, the floor had vanished. The body dropped, the rope snapping taut with a sickening jerk that echoed like a pistol shot in the quiet morning. The legs kicked once, twice, a frantic biological protest against the stillness that was already claiming the rest. Then, nothing. The figure swung gently in the draft, a pendulum marking time for a city that had no idea what second it was. The silence did not break. It deepened, expanding to fill the space where the shout of a crowd should have been. Smith stared at the swaying boots, the leather scuffed from the walk, and felt the hollow ache in his chest widen into a cavern where answers used to be. The machinery had worked. The law was satisfied. But as the fog rolled over the platform, obscuring the dead man's face, Smith knew the transaction was far from complete. The debt remained. The drop thudded, a dull, wet sound that lacked the crisp finality of a gavel. Smith's stomach lurched, a violent heave that forced him to clamp a hand over his mouth, tasting bile and the sour tang of old coffee. He did not vomit. To retch now would be to admit the body's rebellion against the state's decree, and he could not afford such weakness before the sheriffs. The rope creaked, a rhythmic, groaning protest of hemp fibers stretching under the dead weight, a sound far louder than the gasps rising from the street below. It was the noise of a ship rigging in a gale, or perhaps a door closing in a house where no one lived anymore. Below, the silence held, but it was different now, thinner, fractured. A woman near the front row, her bonnet askew and damp with the mist, let out a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, a sharp, jagged noise that tore through the grey air. "Is it done?" she cried, her voice cracking on the vowel. "Has the devil taken him?" "Hush, Martha," a man beside her hissed, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into the wool of her shawl. "He is gone. Look at the feet. They do not move." Smith looked. The boots, scuffed and brown, hung motionless now. The frantic kicking ceased, leaving only the gentle, sickening rotation as the draft caught the trousers. The fog curled around the ankles, obscuring the lower legs, making the body appear to float in a void of grey nothingness, severed from the earth it had walked upon only minutes before. It was an illusion of weightlessness that mocked the brutal physics of the neck breaking, the spine snapping, the life extinguished by a lever pulled by a man in a leather apron. "He wanted it this way," a sheriff muttered nearby, wiping his hands on a handkerchief that was already stained with grease and dirt. No struggle, no prayer, just the drop. "He wanted justice," Smith corrected, the words slipping out before he could check them, dry and brittle as old parchment. The sheriff turned, his face flushed with the cold and the exertion of his duty, eyes narrowing as he recognized the MP. "Justice is a matter for the courts, Mr. Smith. This is merely the settlement of a debt. The Crown is paid." "Paid?" Smith laughed, a short, harsh bark that sounded alien in his own ears. "You think this settles anything? Look at them." He gestured vaguely towards the crowd, though the fog hid most faces, reducing the thousands to a shifting, murmuring mass of shadows and hat brims. "They do not look relieved. They look hungry." "Hungry for blood, you mean?" As the sheriff stepped closer, his voice dropped, turning confidential and dangerous. "Or are you hungry for the chaos you Whigs warned us about? The Luddites, the French spies?" "There are no spies here," Smith said, turning his back on the official because he could not bear the smug certainty in the man's tone. "Only a merchant who asked for a hearing and received a bullet instead. We made him." Every one of us in that chamber filed his letters and ignored his pleas, telling him to wait while the empire burned itself out in Spain and Russia. Wait, the sheriff snorted, spitting a glob of phlegm onto the wet planks of the scaffold. He waited 5 years, sir, in a Russian dungeon. Then he waited another 2 while you lot debated the price of corn and the regency. Patience is a virtue, but you turned it into a weapon. Smith flinched. The accusation landed with the precision of a surgeon's knife, cutting through the layers of political rhetoric and self-justification he had wrapped around himself since May. It was true. They had used delay as a tactic, bureaucracy as a shield, believing that time would erode the sharp edges of a man's grievance until it was dull enough to ignore. They had been wrong. Time had not eroded Bellingham. It had distilled him, boiling away everything but the single, hard core of his rage. A sudden commotion at the base of the gallows broke the morbid trance. A group of soldiers, red coats bright and shocking against the grey fog, surged forward, bayonets fixed, pushing back against a surge in the crowd. "Back," a sergeant shouted, his voice strained with panic. "Make way for the coroner, stand back or I'll fire." "Fire at what?" a voice shouted from the mist, high and shrill. "At the dead man, or at us for watching you kill him?" "Silence!" The sergeant swung his musket, the wooden stock cracking against something solid, eliciting a yelp of pain. "This is an execution, not a fairground. Disperse." But the crowd did not disperse. They pressed closer, a slow, inexorable tide of bodies driven by a morbid fascination that transcended fear. They were not rioting. They were not throwing stones or chanting slogans of revolution. They were simply watching, their faces upturned, pale and blank in the fog, absorbing the spectacle of the state killing its own citizen with a mechanical efficiency that felt obscene in the quiet morning air. It was a performance of power that rang hollow, a theater of justice where the audience knew the play was rigged. Smith leaned against the railing, the wet wood seeping through the sleeve of his coat, chilling his arm to the bone. He felt exhausted, a deep, marrow-level weariness that had nothing to do with the lack of sleep or the long walk from Westminster. It was the fatigue of a man who sees the machinery of his world grinding forward, crushing everything in its path, and knows he is powerless to stop it. He had come here expecting closure, a final period at the end of a sentences that had begun with a pistol shot in the lobby. Instead, he found only a comma, a pause before the next clause of the nation's long, troubled history. "The rope is cutting in," the chaplain whispered, standing beside him again, his spectacles dripping with condensation. "It is nearly over. The strangulation will finish what the drop started." "It is already finished," Smith said, his voice barely audible over the creaking of the hemp. "He died the moment we decided he did not matter." "Do not speak so, sir," the chaplain urged, touching Smith's elbow, his grip surprisingly strong. "It is not for us to judge the heart of the man, only his actions." "His actions were a mirror," Smith replied, pulling his arm away, "and we do not like what we see in it." Below, the surgeon stepped forward, a black bag in hand, accompanied by 2 assistants carrying a stretcher. They moved with the brisk, impersonal air of men who had done this 100 times before, checking the pulse at the wrist, the dilation of the eyes, the stillness of the chest. "Dead," the surgeon announced, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "Certified at 8:12. A ripple went through the crowd, a sigh that sounded like wind rushing through dry leaves. Then the murmuring began again, low and urgent, as people started to turn away. The spectacle concluded, the hunger momentarily sated. The soldiers lowered their bayonets, the tension draining from their shoulders, replaced by the dull routine of crowd control. The show was over. The market would open. The carriages would roll. Life would resume its indifferent march. Smith watched the surgeon's assistants hook the body, lifting it down from the drop with a grunt of effort. The head lolled forward, the white cap askew, revealing a sliver of the bruised neck beneath. It looked small now, insignificant, just a bundle of clothes and broken bone. The great grievance, the solitary act that had shaken the empire, reduced to a corpse to be carted off for dissection or burial, depending on the whims of the crown. "He is gone," the sheriff said, clapping Smith on the shoulder with a heavy, familiar gesture that made the MP recoil. "Come, sir, let us get you down, for there is brandy in the vestry and you look as though you might faint." "I will not faint," Smith said, straightening his coat, forcing his spine to lock into its familiar, rigid posture. "But I will not drink with you either." "As you wish," the sheriff shrugged, turning away to direct the removal of the body. "The world moves on, Mr. Smith. It always does." Smith watched him go, then turned his gaze back to the fog-choked street below where the crowd was thinning, though not fast enough. Some lingered, staring up at the empty trapdoor and the swaying rope that now held nothing but air. They were waiting for something else, a sign, a word, or perhaps a revolution that would not come. "The world moves on," Smith repeated softly, the words tasting like ash. "But where is it going?" He gripped the railing one last time, the wood slick and cold under his palm, and felt a sudden, terrifying certainty that the silence of the crowd was not peace. It was the holding of breath before a scream that had not yet found its voice. The debt remained, and sooner or later the collector would come for the rest of them. Smith turned away from the edge, his boots clicking sharply on the wet planks, and walked towards the stairs, leaving the hanging rope to swing alone in the grey dawn. The smell of lye scrubbed the nose raw. William Smith stepped into the lobby, and the scent hit him first, a chemical sting that buried the memory of copper and wet wool. It was sharp, alkaline, the odor of a housewife trying to bleach a stain from a tablecloth. Only here the tablecloth was the floor of the empire, and the stain had been a prime minister. He stopped. His boot heel clicked on the stone, a solitary sound in the cavernous space that usually thrummed with the murmur of petitioners and the rustle of silk. "Mr. Smith." The voice came from the shadows near the great door, where a clerk stood holding a stack of parchment tied with red tape. The man's face was pinched, his eyes darting towards the center of the room before fixing on Smith's shoes. "Mr. Holloway," Smith said, nodding once while remaining rooted in place. He did not move forward. "You are early." "The Speaker wishes to clear the order paper before the House sits," Holloway replied, shifting the weight of the documents. He hugged the stack to his chest as if it might shield him from the air itself. "They have been at it since 4, scrubbing." "I see." Smith looked down. The flags were pale, almost white in the grey morning light filtering through the high windows. Where Spencer Perceval had fallen, where the crimson bloom had spread with such terrible, organic speed across the white waistcoat and onto the cold stone, there was now only a dull, scrubbed patch. The stone looked raw, its surface eaten away by the brush and the harsh soap. It was cleaner than the rest of the floor, a ghostly rectangle that drew the eye and held it, demanding a confession no one would give. "They used pumice," Holloway muttered, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light. "The sergeant said vinegar first, to lift the color, then the lye, twice over. He said it had to be done before the members arrived." "And is it done?" Smith asked. He took a step forward, the sole of his shoe meeting the damp stone. It felt slick, treacherous. "Does it look as though nothing happened?" Holloway swallowed, his throat working visibly beneath his starched collar. "It looks tidy, sir. That is what they wanted, tidy." "Tidy?" Smith tasted the word. It sat heavy on his tongue, flat and meaningless. "A man is unmade in this corridor, Holloway. His life leaks out onto these flags while we debate the price of grain, and the solution is to scrub until the stone bleeds white." "I only carry the papers, Mr. Smith," the clerk said, backing away slightly, his shoulders hunching as if expecting a blow. "The order is to restore the room. The King's business must proceed." "The King's business." Smith turned his head slowly, watching a group of members enter from the Commons chamber. They were laughing. 2 of them, stout men in dark blue coats, were recounting a joke about a horse and a muddy road, their voices bouncing off the vaulted ceiling with casual, unthinking volume. They walked right past the scrubbed patch. One of them, a baronet from the West Country, stepped directly onto the pale rectangle, his polished boot leaving a faint, muddy print on the wet stone. He did not look down. He did not pause. He continued laughing, gesturing with a gloved hand as he made his point about the turnip yield. "Look at them," Smith said, his voice tight. "Do they not see it?" "See what, sir?" Holloway asked, though his eyes flickered towards the baronet's feet. "The spot," Smith hissed, "the place where he died. They walk over it as if it were a spill of claret at dinner." "It is just stone, Mr. Smith," Holloway said, his voice trembling slightly. Stone does not remember. Stone remembers everything, Smith countered. He walked towards the patch, drawn to it like a moth to a guttering candle. He knelt, ignoring the ache in his knees, and ran his fingers over the surface. It was rough, pitted where the lye had bitten deep. Underneath the chemical sting, if he pressed his nose close enough, he thought he could smell its stiller, a faint, sweet iron tang that no amount of vinegar could erase. It was the smell of the end of something. They think if they wash away the blood, they wash away the guilt. They think if they laugh loud enough, the silence will not catch up. Sir, please, Holloway whispered, his gaze darting nervously towards the laughing members. The Speaker will call the House to order shortly. You should take your seat. Smith stood up, brushing the dust from his breeches. His hands were shaking, a fine tremor that he clenched into fists to hide. He looked at the baronet, who was now shaking hands with another member, his grip firm, his smile wide and untroubled. The normalcy of it was a violence all its own. It was a betrayal more profound than the pistol shot. Bellingham had fired a bullet to stop the machine. The machine had simply oiled its gears and kept turning, grinding the memory of the dead into dust. I will take my seat, Smith said. He straightened his coat, pulling the fabric tight over his narrow shoulders. But I will not laugh today, Holloway, I cannot. No one expects you to, sir. Don't they? Smith looked around the lobby, at the polished wood, the high arches, the men adjusting their wigs and checking their watches. They expect everything to be as it was. They expect the world to make sense again because the floor is clean. He began to walk towards the chamber door, his steps measured, deliberate. He forced himself to step on the scrubbed patch. The stone was cold, seeping through the leather of his boot, a chill that climbed his leg and settled in his gut. Mr. Smith, Holloway called out, his voice cracking slightly, there is a packet for you on your desk. Smith paused, hand on the brass handle of the chamber door. The noise from inside was growing, a roar of voices debating the orders in council, the war with France, the endless, hungry machinery of state. A packet. From the north, the clerk said, holding up a sealed envelope stained with travel grime. Arrived on the morning coach. The postmaster said to give it to you directly. He said the seal was broken already by the censors, but... Smith took the letter. The paper was thick, coarse. He could feel the weight of it, the urgency in the way the wax had been cracked and resealed with government red. He did not open it. He knew what it would say before he broke the seal. He could hear the distant rattle of looms being smashed, the cry of the hungry, the fire in the night sky of Nottinghamshire. The unrest had not stopped. The hanging had not fixed it. The blood in the lobby had not bought peace. Thank you, Holloway, Smith said, slipping the letter into his pocket. It burned against his thigh. Will you speak to it, sir? The clerk asked, nodding towards the chamber. The reform, the merchants. Smith looked back at the scrubbed floor, then at the laughing baronet, who was now bowing to a lord. The machine was ready. The gears were oiled. The blood was gone. I will speak, Smith said, his voice low, a promise made to the empty air. But I fear no one is listening anymore. He pushed the door open and stepped into the roar, the letter heavy in his pocket, a dead weight dragging him down as the voices of the living swallowed him whole. The roar inside did not hit, it pressed. A physical wall of sound, dense with the drone of 300 men arguing over grain tariffs and French blockades, shoved against Smith's chest the moment he crossed the threshold. He stumbled, just a half step, his boot catching on the runner carpet that had been laid fresh over the flags. The air was thick, a stew of stale tobacco, wet wool drying on heated bodies, and the sharp, acidic tang of the tallow candles guttering in the drafts. It smelled of life continuing, indifferent and robust. Order, order in the House. The Speaker's gavel cracked, a dry splinter of wood against the desk, but the noise barely dipped. It merely shifted pitch, a great beast rolling over to find a more comfortable position. Smith moved down the aisle, keeping his eyes fixed on the back of the bench ahead, refusing to let his gaze drift to the floor. He knew where the spot was. Even under the new runner, he could feel the geometry of it, the exact coordinate where Spencer Perceval had folded, his white waistcoat blooming red, the life draining out onto the stone, while the world held its breath for a second that felt like an hour. Now the runner was clean, beige, unstained, a lye woven from hemp and wool. He reached his seat and sat, the wood hard against his spine. The letter in his pocket felt heavy, a lead weight dragging at his coat tail. He did not reach for it. Not yet. To pull it out now would be to invite questions, to draw attention to the north, to the smouldering ruins of Nottinghamshire, and he was not ready to hear the polite dismissals, the soothing platitudes about temporary disturbances and necessary firmness. "Mr. Smith," a voice murmured to his left, "you look pale. The air in the lobby disagree with you." It was Vaughan. His face was flushed, eyes bright with the fervor of a man who had just won a point on a subcommittee. He leaned in, the scent of brandy and mint wafting from him, cloying and sweet. "The air is fine," Smith said. His own voice sounded thin, scraped raw. "It is the silence I find difficult." Vaughan blinked, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before resetting, brighter than before. "Silence? There is hardly a quiet moment in this chamber since the tragedy. We are all speaking at once, trying to drown out the memory, I suppose. A natural reaction." "Is it?" Smith turned to face him. The movement felt stiff, as if his joints were packed with sand. "Or is it a deliberate erasure? We scrub the floor, we lay down a runner, and we shout about the orders in council until we forget that a man was murdered 10 feet from where you sit." Vaughan shifted, pulling his coat tighter around his middle. He glanced around, checking to see if anyone else had heard. "Murdered, yes, a terrible crime, but Bellingham is dead, Smith, hung at Newgate 3 days ago. The law has been satisfied, justice is done. To dwell on it, it serves no purpose. The country needs stability, the markets need confidence." "Justice," Smith repeated. The word tasted like ash. "You call hanging a desperate man justice? You call ignoring the petitions that drove him to madness justice?" "I call it the end of the matter," Vaughan said, his voice dropping, hardening. "We have a war with Bonaparte to fund. We have unrest in the mills to quell. We cannot have members of this House paralyzed by guilt over a single, isolated incident. Bellingham acted alone, a madman, nothing more." "Did he?" Smith's hand drifted to his pocket, fingers brushing the coarse paper of the letter. "Or did we make him? Did we not ignore his letters? Did we not turn our backs on his grievances until he had no other language left but laid?" Vaughan recoiled as if struck. "That is dangerous talk, Smith, dangerous. Do not let your abolitionist sympathies cloud your judgment. There is no conspiracy. There is no grand design. Just a merchant who lost his mind and took the Prime Minister with him. It is over." "It is not over," Smith whispered. "Look at the north." "The north will be managed," Vaughan snapped, turning away, dismissing the conversation with a sharp twitch of his shoulder. "The troops are moving. Order will be restored." Smith looked out over the benches. The debate had moved on. They were discussing the price of iron, the supply lines to Lisbon, the allocation of funds for new frigates. Voices rose and fell, rhythmic and hypnotic. A man 2 rows ahead was eating an apple, the crunch of the fruit loud in the pauses between speeches. Another was passing a note, folded neatly, smiling as he did so. They were alive. They were vibrant. They were utterly unchanged. Perceval was gone. The man who had walked these halls, who had worried about the same bills, who had feared the same wars, was dust, and the machine had not even stuttered. It had absorbed the shock, digested the violence, and excreted it as business as usual. The horror was not in the blood, Smith realized with a sinking clarity. The horror was in the cleanliness. The horror was in the ease with which the state replaced a dead leader with an agenda item. He pulled the letter from his pocket. The wax seal was broken, the red crust flaking onto his thumb. He smoothed the paper on his knee, shielding it from Vaughan's peripheral vision. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, the ink splattered where the quill had been pressed too hard. "Mr. Smith," it began, no salutation, no deference. "The fires in Nottingham have not gone out. They say the hanging stopped it. They lie. The looms are still breaking. The men are still hungry. The soldier you sent to Leicester fired on the crowd yesterday. 3 dead, a woman and 2 boys. Bellingham is dead, but the grievance lives. It breathes. It eats. And your Parliament sits here and argues about the price of iron while the country burns." Smith's finger traced the words, 3 dead, a woman and 2 boys, not combatants, not insurgents, just people. The ink seemed to swim before his eyes. He looked up at the speaker, who was nodding sagely at a member detailing the merits of a new tax on wool. The gavel rested on the desk, innocent wood. "Mr. Smith," Vaughan asked again, not looking at him, his attention fixed on the speaker. "Are you going to raise your point on the merchant petitions? You had the floor for 2 minutes before the interruption." Smith looked down at the letter. Then he looked at the runner covering the spot where Perceval had died. He thought of the scrubbed flags in the lobby, the lie burning the stone, the desperate attempt to wash away the past. He thought of the woman in Leicester, the 2 boys, the smoke rising over the mills. He folded the letter slowly, deliberately. He placed it back in his pocket, next to his heart, where it burned cold. "No," Smith said. His voice was steady now, stripped of hope, stripped of anger, just tired. "There is no point." "No point," Vaughan frowned, finally turning to look at him. "But you said it was vital, the treatment of imprisoned merchants, the diplomatic failures." "It is vital," Smith agreed. He watched a fly land on the polished wood of the desk in front of him, crawl along the grain, and take flight again. "But no one is listening. The machine does not care about the gears it grinds up, Vaughan. It only cares that it turns." He stood up. The movement was abrupt, causing the man behind him to shift in surprise. Smith did not apologize. He stepped out of the bench into the aisle. The runner felt spongy under his boots, insulating him from the stone below, insulating him from the truth. "Where are you going?" Vaughan hissed. "The session is not ended." "I am going to find the woman," Smith said, though he knew he would not. He would go to his study. He would pour a glass of wine. He would sit in the dark and write a letter that no one would read. "Someone has to remember them. If the house will not, then I must." He walked towards the door, the roar of the debate swelling behind him, a tide of noise that threatened to swallow him whole. He did not look back. He could not. If he looked back, he might see the ghost of Perceval standing in the aisle, or the shadow of Bellingham lurking in the corners, or worse, he might see nothing at all. Just men in wigs, arguing over iron, while the world burned outside the walls. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the corridor. The air here was cooler, quieter. The lobby stretched before him, empty now, the scrubbed patch gleaming faintly in the candlelight. He walked towards it, drawn again, unable to stop. He stopped exactly where the pale stone began. He looked down. Nothing, just stone. "Stone does not remember," Holloway had said. Smith closed his eyes. He could smell it still. The iron, the sweet, cloying scent of end things. "No," he whispered to the empty room, "but I do." He turned and walked away, the sound of his own footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence, a solitary rhythm against the distant, indifferent roar of the house. The brine hit him first, a wet slap against the cheek that tasted of rotting eel and low-tide mud. Smith stopped. His boots sank an inch into the slick, black sludge coating the embankment stones, the cold seeping through the leather sole to bite at his arches. He wrinkled his nose. The air hung thick, a wool blanket soaked in coal smoke and the sour tang of horse piss drifting down from the streets above. Dawn was not breaking, it was merely leaking, a grey seepage that diluted the darkness without promising light. "Damn this fog," he muttered, the words snatched instantly by the damp wind. He pulled his coat tighter, the rough wool scratching his neck, and stared at the Thames. The water moved with a sluggish, oily heaviness, churning black against the stone pilings of the old stairs. It did not care. That was the thought that had kept him awake since the drop at Newgate, since the body of John Bellingham had been cut down and carted off to be dissected by surgeons who cared nothing for the merchant's grievance or the Prime Minister's soul. The river flowed on. It swallowed the refuse of the tanneries, the night soil from the barges, the blood of the executed, and gave nothing back but this stench. Smith kicked a piece of driftwood, rot-softened and grey, watching it bob once before vanishing into the murk. A barge drifted past, silent as a ghost in the gloom. The oarsman, a shapeless lump in an oilskin coat, dipped his blade with a rhythmic creak gurgle that seemed to measure the heartbeat of the city itself. Smith watched the man's shoulders hunch and straighten, a mechanical repetition that mirrored the grinding of the state. "Morning to you," Smith called out, though he knew the man would not hear or answer. The oarsman did not look up. The barge slid on, carrying timber perhaps, or grain, or nothing at all but the weight of its own existence. Smith turned his collar up against the damp. His fingers brushed the paper in his inner pocket, the folded sheet of the unsigned memorandum he had retrieved from his study before leaving the house. He had not read it again. He did not need to. The words were burned into his mind, a catalogue of ignored pleas and bureaucratic silence that had curdled into a pistol shot. Complicity. The word sat in his gut like a stone. He walked further along the path, the mud sucking at his heels with every step. To his left, the city rose in jagged silhouettes, the spires of St. Martin in the Fields piercing the grey like accusing fingers. Somewhere up there, the clerks were already arriving at their desks, dipping quills into ink pots, opening ledgers to fresh pages. They would write the minutes. They would record the motion. They would note the vacancy in the Treasury and the need for a new First Lord, all in a hand so neat it obscured the blood. "And so we continue," Smith said to the empty air. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of burning peat from a riverside hovel. He flinched. It smelled of the north, of the mills in Nottinghamshire where the frames had been smashed and the boys beaten. The government called it a conspiracy. They whispered of Jacobins, of French agents, of a coordinated Luddite uprising that had found its voice in Bellingham's pistol. Smith knew better. He had seen the eyes of the merchant in the lobby before the shot, the blank, terrible focus of a man who had run out of roads. There was no grand design, no shadowy committee meeting in a cellar. Just one man, broken by the indifference of the machine, striking back at the only face the machine wore. Perceval. Name brought the image back, unbidden and sharp. Not the statesman in his robes, not the leader of the house, but the man falling. The way the white waistcoat had bloomed crimson so fast, so violently bright against the drab stone of the lobby. And Jane, Mrs. Perceval. Smith closed his eyes for a second, swaying slightly as the ground seemed to tilt beneath him. She had not screamed. That was what haunted him. In the chaos, with MPs shouting and servants running for water, she had stood still. Her face had been a mask of composed horror, a silence so profound it had swallowed the noise of the room. She had looked at Smith, just for an instant, and in that look was a judgment heavier than any the courts could pronounce. She knew, they all knew, but she knew, that the state had failed her husband not by malice, but by 1,000 small neglects, 1,000 unsigned papers, 1,000 doors left closed. Smith opened his eyes. The barge was gone, swallowed by the fog. The river remained indifferent. He leaned against the cold stone of the embankment, the rough texture scraping his palm. His breath plumed before him, white and transient. The war with America was coming. He could feel it in the tension of the merchants, in the editorials demanding honor, in the way the king's ministers spoke of the Yankees with a mixture of disdain and panic. Another conflict, another drain on the Treasury, more boys to fill the grave that Bellingham had already started digging. The nation sleepwalked towards the cliff edge, eyes fixed on the horizon, blind to the crack in the floorboards beneath their feet. "Madness," Smith whispered, "sheer madness." A gull cried overhead, a harsh, tearing sound that echoed off the water. It circled once, then dove, disappearing into the grey mist. Smith pushed himself away from the wall. His legs felt heavy, filled with lead, but he forced them to move. Standing here accomplished nothing. The cold would only seep deeper into his bones, settling in the joints, making him older than his 57 years. He had a duty. Not to fix Eater, the world was too broken for one weary MP to mend her, but to witness. To carry the memory of the blood on the flags when the scrubbing brushes had done their work. To remember the silence of the widow and the singular, desperate roar of the assassin. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim low over his eyes. The path ahead wound back towards Westminster, towards the heat and noise and lying decency of the Commons. He took a step. The mud released his boot with a wet schluck. He took another. The city waited. The gears ground on. Smith walked into the fog, the taste of the river still on his tongue, bitter and unyielding, as the first true light of morning finally breached the clouds, illuminating the long, hard road back to the house. The mist clung to the wool of Smith's coat, a damp weight that smelled of river mud and the sour dregs of last night's gin from the riverside taverns. He stopped. His boots sank slightly into the soft earth of the path, the suction a quiet protest against his forward motion. "Madness," he said again, but the word fractured, lost in the vast, grey emptiness before him. It was not merely the war with America that gnawed at his gut, a cold, hollow ache that no amount of breakfast or brandy could soothe. It was the terrifying ease with which the machinery of empire stumbled blindly towards the cliff, driven by the same stubborn inertia that had left Bellingham's petitions gathering dust in a clerk's drawer until despair curdled into violence. The nation sleepwalked, eyes fixed on the horizon of French bayonets or Yankee privateers, utterly blind to the rot in the floorboards beneath their feet, the structural failure of a system that valued procedure over people until a pistol shot tore the veil aside. Smith rubbed his thumb against the seam of his pocket, feeling the sharp corner of the folded paper within, a tangible shard of his own complicity. He had signed nothing. He had spoken little. But he had sat there, warm and fed, while the merchant froze in the cold of official neglect. A barge drifted past, low in the water, laden with coal that stained the hull black as ink. The oarsman leaned into his stroke, muscles bunching under a ragged shirt, the rhythmic creak-gurgle of the oars cutting through the silence with a mechanical precision that felt obscene against the chaos of human grief. Smith watched the man's back, the repetitive hunch and straighten, and felt a sudden, violent urge to shout, to warn him that the world was ending, that the Prime Minister was dead, that the Americans were coming to burn their ports, but the words died in his throat, choked by the futility of it all. What would the oarsman care? The tide waited for no MP. The river cared nothing for Perceval. "Keep moving," Smith whispered to himself, forcing his legs to lift. Image of Jane Perceval rose unbidden, sharp and unyielding as broken glass. Not the public widow, draped in black lace and surrounded by sympathizing duchesses, but the woman in the lobby, standing alone amidst the shouting men and the spreading pool of blood. She had not screamed. That was the horror of it. While the servants ran for water and the MPs barked orders, she had stood perfectly still, her face a mask of composed devastation that stripped away every pretense of political grandeur. Her eyes had met Smith's for a fleeting second, and in that glance was a judgment heavier than any the courts could pronounce, a silent accusation that the state had failed her husband not through malice, but through 1,000 small, mundane acts of ignoring, delaying, and dismissing. She knew, they all knew, but she knew with a clarity that made Smith's skin crawl. The ease with which one man could halt the empire was not a testament to Bellingham's power, but to the fragility of the whole bloody edifice, balanced on a knife edge of ignored grievances and bureaucratic silence. Smith stumbled, his toe catching on a protruding root. He righted himself, brushing dirt from his coat sleeve with a trembling hand. The fog thinned slightly, revealing the jagged silhouette of Westminster Bridge, the arches looming like the ribs of a leviathan picked clean by time. The war was coming. He could feel it in the tension of the air, in the way the merchants spoke in hushed tones of embargoes and honor, in the frantic scribbling of clerks preparing mobilization orders. Another conflict. Another drain on the treasury, more boys to fill the grave that Bellingham had already started digging with his single, desperate act. The nation rushed towards the cliff, eager to prove its strength, blind to the fact that the ground was already crumbling beneath them. "Fools," Smith said, the word harsh in the quiet morning. "We are all fools." A gull cried overhead, a tearing sound that echoed off the water, harsh and lonely. It circled once, wings cutting the grey, then dove disappearing into the mist below. Smith watched the spot where the bird had vanished, wondering if it would rise again or if the river had claimed it too. The indifference of nature was a comfort, in a twisted sort of way. The Thames flowed on, dark and churning, unmoved by the assassination, unmoved by the coming war, unmoved by the grief of a widow or the guilt of an MP. It simply was, and perhaps that was the only truth left. He stopped again, leaning against the cold stone of the embankment, the rough texture scraping his palm through the glove. His breath plumed before him, white and transient, vanishing as quickly as the life of the Prime Minister. The barge had passed, swallowed by the fog, leaving only the ripple of its wake to mark its passage. The creek gurgle faded, replaced by the distant tolling of a church bell, measuring out the hour with a solemnity that felt mocking. 5 o'clock. The time the shot was fired. The time the world changed. "And so we continue," Smith said, his voice barely a whisper. He pushed himself away from the wall, the stone cold seeping into his bones. Standing here accomplished nothing. The cold would only settle deeper, stiffening his joints, making him older than his 57 years. He had a duty. Not to fix either. The world was too broken, too bent on its own destruction for one weary MP to mend her, but to witness. To carry the memory of the blood on the flags when the scrubbing brushes had done their work and the floor was polished clean for the next session. To remember the silence of the widow and the singular, desperate roar of the assassin. To hold the weight of the unsigned memorandum in his pocket and let it burn him, a constant reminder of the cost of inaction. Smith adjusted his hat, pulling the brim low over his eyes to shield them from the grey light. The path ahead wound back towards the city, towards the heat and noise and lying decency of the commons. He took a step. The mud released his boot with a wet schluck. He took another. The city waited, vast and hungry, ready to consume another day, another debate, another life. The gears ground on, indifferent to the friction, indifferent to the blood in the oil. Smith walked into the fog, the taste of the river still on his tongue, bitter and unyielding, as the first true light of morning finally breached the clouds, illuminating the long, hard road back to the house, where the dead man's seat sat empty, waiting for someone to fill it, waiting for the next motion to be called, waiting for the world to end again in slow, bureaucratic increments. He turned the corner, the spires of St. Martin in the fields piercing the sky like accusing fingers. The bells tolled again, 6 strikes, time to go in, time to sit, time to watch the machine eat itself alive. Smith squared his shoulders, the movement stiff and painful, and walked on, the fog closing around him like a shroud, hiding the tears that finally, quietly began to fall. The lobby's shadow is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. The assassination of the Prime Minister, John Bellingham, and the murder of Spencer Perceval, Internet Archive. Assassination of the Prime Minister, the shocking death of Spencer Perceval, Internet Archive. Why Spencer Perceval had to die, the assassination of a British Prime Minister, Internet Archive. Assassination of Spencer Perceval. John Bellingham. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.